On my son's wedding day, he looked me dead in the eye, called me an embarrassment, and shaved my head in front of his wealthy new family. He thought he was erasing my dignity to fit into his new high society life. The entire room fell silent. I stood there humiliated but quiet. I did not scream. I did not fight back. I just watched my hair fall to the floor. But what I did exactly 2 hours later brought his entire millionaire wedding crashing down on the most important day of his life. I am Desmond, 72 years old, and for my entire life I believed that blood was thicker than water. Today I am here to tell you how I learned that loyalty cannot be bought and betrayal always comes with a devastating price. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who mistook your silence for weakness. The VIP lounge of the Oak Ridge Country Club smelled of expensive cigars, imported leather, and arrogant privilege. I sat quietly in the corner of the room, adjusting the cuffs of my simple but clean charcoal suit. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my son Julian's life. He was marrying Chloe Kensington, the daughter of a prominent real estate dynasty. I had spent decades breathing in concrete dust, waking up before dawn, and breaking my back on construction sites just so Julian could attend the best private schools. I sacrificed my own comfort so he could sit at tables with people like the Kensingtons. But as the heavy oak door to the lounge swung open, I quickly realized my sacrifices meant absolutely nothing to him. Julian walked in looking sharp in a custom white tuxedo. Right behind him was his future father-in-law, Richard Kensington, a man whose tailored suit could not hide the sneer permanently plastered on his face. Julian did not greet me. He did not hug me. Instead, he tossed a plastic garment bag onto the glass coffee table. Inside was a cheap, ill-fitting beige suit. "Put this on." Julian demanded, his voice tight with anxiety. "You cannot wear that old charcoal thing out there. You look like a janitor who wandered into the wrong building." I looked at the cheap fabric and then at my son. Before I could speak, Richard Kensington stepped forward, waving his hand dismissively in my direction. "The suit is the least of our problems, Julian," Richard said, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. He pointed his manicured finger directly at my head. "Look at his hair. It is completely unacceptable. We have state senators and venture capitalists sitting in that ballroom. He looks like a street thug. I will not have those unkempt dreadlocks ruining our family portraits." My breath caught in my throat. I had worn my hair in traditional locks for over 30 years. It was not a fashion statement. It was a vow. When my beautiful wife Vivian was dying of cancer, she used to weave her weak fingers through my hair. Her last words to me were a plea to never let our son forget his roots, to never let him erase where he came from, just to appease a world that would only ever see him as a token. My hair was my physical connection to the woman I loved and the history I survived. "My hair stays exactly as it is," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Vivian loved this hair. It is a part of who I am, and I am not changing my identity for a photograph." Julian's face turned crimson with rage. He looked absolutely terrified of displeasing his wealthy father-in-law. "You are so stubborn," Julian hissed, stepping closer to me. "This is exactly why I moved out. You always have to make everything about your pride. You are an embarrassment to me. Do you understand that? You do not belong in this world, and you are trying to drag me down with you." Richard gave a cold nod toward the door. Two massive security guardsmen on the Kensington payroll stepped into the room. Julian walked over to the door and locked it with a loud, heavy click. My heart began to pound, but I refused to show fear. The guards moved in fast. They grabbed me by the shoulders and forced me down into the heavy leather armchair. I struggled, my old muscles tensing against their grip. But there were two of them, and they were young and heavy. They pinned my arms to the armrests. Richard stood back, checking his expensive watch with complete indifference, while Julian reached into a leather grooming bag on the table and pulled out a heavy-duty electric hair clipper. He flipped the switch. The loud, aggressive buzzing sound filled the small room. I stared directly into my son's eyes, searching for a shred of the boy I had raised, a shred of Vivian kindness. There was nothing there, only a desperate, pathetic hunger for white approval. "Do not make a scene, old man," Julian sneered, bringing the vibrating blades right to my forehead. "I am not going to let your ghetto aesthetic ruin the day I officially enter the upper class." He pressed the cold metal against my scalp. I felt the sharp teeth of the clipper bite into my hair. The thick, graying locks that my wife used to hold began to fall away, tumbling past my eyes and landing softly on the lapels of my suit. The physical sensation was violating, but the emotional betrayal was a knife twisting directly in my heart. My own blood. the boy I had starved for so he could eat. He was erasing my identity just to buy a few smiles from a family of arrogant strangers. It took less than 3 minutes. When the buzzing finally stopped, the room fell completely silent. The security guards let go of my arms and stepped back. Richard Kensington smirked, looking at my bare, scraped scalp with a look of mild satisfaction. "Much better," Richard said smoothly. "Now put on the cheap suit and stay in the back row when the cameras come out." Any normal man would have screamed. Any normal father would have thrown a punch, flipped the table, or broken down in tears of absolute heartbreak. But I am not a normal man. I spent my entire life learning that raw anger makes you sloppy, but silent, calculated rage makes you lethal. I slowly stood up from the leather chair. I did not raise a hand to my bald head. I did not touch the small stinging scratches the rushed clippers had left on my skin. I simply looked down at the pile of my own hair resting on the floor, and then I looked directly at Julian. He swallowed hard, taking a slight step backward, expecting a violent explosion. I reached up and calmly brushed a few loose strands of hair off the shoulder of my suit. I looked my son dead in the eye, my voice perfectly steady, carrying the heavy weight of a judge about to deliver a death sentence. "All right, son," I said quietly. "Now go out there and enjoy your wedding." Julian blinked, totally unnerved by my calm reaction, but he quickly masked it with a scoff. He turned on his heel and walked out the door with Richard trailing close behind. They thought they had just broken a poor, helpless old man. They thought they had put me in my place. They had absolutely no idea that the silent old man they just humiliated was the hidden owner of the Vanguard Equities empire. They had just handed a loaded gun to the man who secretly owned the very ground they walked on. And tonight, I was going to pull the trigger. The heavy oak door closed behind me with a sickening thud, leaving me standing alone in the grand hallway of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The cold air conditioning of the corridor immediately hit my bare scalp, sending a sharp stinging sensation across the fresh scratches Julian had carelessly left behind. My head felt painfully light and incredibly vulnerable. For over 30 years, my hair had been my crown, a physical and spiritual reminder of my beloved Vivian. Now it was just a pile of discarded clippings, swept away like meaningless trash by a country club janitor. I took a deep breath, letting the chilled air fill my lungs. I walked slowly toward the main ballroom, keeping my posture perfectly straight, but deliberately allowing my eyes to cast downward. I was playing the role of the defeated old man they fully expected to see. The grand ballroom was a blinding display of excessive, unchecked wealth. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the vaulted ceilings, illuminating a massive sea of tailored tuxedos and designer silk gowns. This was the absolute inner circle of the city elite, a world entirely built on generational wealth, exclusion, and arrogant privilege. As I stepped onto the plush carpet, the lively chatter nearest to the entrance suddenly died down. The silence spread like a highly contagious virus, rippling across the massive room table by table, until hundreds of wealthy, primarily white guests were staring directly at me. I could hear their hushed whispers cutting clearly through the soft classical music playing in the background. They pointed their expensive champagne flutes in my direction. Their eyes were filled with a toxic, sickening mixture of pity and absolute contempt. "Look at him," one woman whispered to her husband, her voice loud enough for me to hear. "He looks completely lost and out of place here." I heard another older man chuckle softly and mutter to his table that Julian was certainly doing his best to civilize his rough background, but you simply cannot polish cheap dirt. I let their cruel, arrogant words wash over me completely unbothered. They looked at my ill-fitting beige suit, the cheap polyester garment Julian had forced upon me, and saw a man who had amounted to nothing. They did not know the heavy, brutal history carved into the bones of my hands. As I walked past the glaring eyes of the high society elite, I thought about the sheer amount of concrete dust I had inhaled over the past 40 years. I remembered the blistering summer heat, the aching muscles, and the countless grueling 16-hour shifts I pulled as a general contractor. I broke my back laying the actual physical foundations of this city just so I could afford to send Julian to the most elite private academies. I paid for him to learn how to walk and talk exactly like the people currently laughing at me. I wanted him to have the opportunities I was denied. I wanted him to command respect. But education is a very dangerous thing when it completely lacks character. The more Julian learned about the world of the wealthy, the more he fiercely resented the man who was paying for his entry ticket. He grew deeply ashamed of the thick calluses on my hands. He grew ashamed of our modest home and our humble beginnings. The ultimate betrayal came 2 years ago when he started dating Chloe Kensington. Within months of meeting her wealthy family, Julian packed his bags and moved directly into the massive Kensington estate. He stopped returning my phone calls entirely. He changed his mailing address and erased me from his daily life. The final knife to the chest was when I overheard him at a public charity dinner introducing Richard Kensington to his friends as the father he always wished he had. He happily traded his own blood and his own history for a slice of their fake, glamorous pie. I found an empty seat near the very back of the room, right next to the kitchen swinging doors, exactly where Richard had instructed me to stay hidden. I had barely sat down when a cloud of overpowering, expensive perfume assaulted my senses. Chloe, my brand new daughter-in-law, was walking purposely toward me. She wore a stunning, custom-laced gown that probably cost more than most working-class families make in an entire year. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and a massive diamond necklace rested heavily on her chest. But the wicked, arrogant sneer on her face ruined any possible illusion of beauty. She stopped right in front of my small table, looking down at my scratched, bald head with a look of absolute satisfaction. "Well, Desmond," she said, her voice dripping with sickly, sweet condescension. "I see Julian finally managed to clean you up. You look much better without that awful mess on your head. It is almost presentable for our guests." She did not call me Dad. She did not even call me Mr. Holloway. She addressed me by my first name like I was a stubborn, disobedient child who had finally been disciplined by his betters. I did not respond to her insult. I just looked up at her, keeping my expression perfectly blank and unreadable. Chloe smirked, clearly enjoying what she firmly believed was my complete and utter submission. She reached into a small, elegant silk clutch she was carrying and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. She tossed the heavy stack of papers directly onto my lap. It landed with a soft thud against the cheap fabric of my beige suit. "Make sure you come up to the stage and sign this later when my father calls your name," she commanded, crossing her arms over her chest like a dictator giving an order. "It is a transfer of deed. Since you clearly do not have the financial funds to contribute to our new luxury life together, my father thought this would be the only wedding gift you could actually afford to give us. Consider it your required admission ticket to stay in Julian life." Chloe turned on her expensive heel and glided back across the marble floor toward the sweetheart table where Julian was waiting for her with a fresh glass of champagne. I looked down at the thick document resting heavily on my lap. I slowly unfolded the crisp white pages. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon with the lightning speed and flawless precision of a man who had spent 3 decades navigating complex corporate real estate law in the shadows. It was an unconditional, irrevocable transfer of property. They were legally demanding the deeds to the 50-hectare plot of undeveloped land my family had owned for 3 generations. The land was located just outside the city limits, sitting right in the middle of a highly coveted, massively profitable new commercial development zone. The sheer audacity of the demand was breathtaking. They were not just asking for a traditional wedding blessing. They were executing a bold daylight robbery disguised as a family milestone. The message hidden between the legal lines was crystal clear. If I did not sign this document in front of all these wealthy people tonight, Julian would be utterly useless to them. I knew exactly how these elite families operated. Julian genuinely thought they loved him, but he was nothing but a pawn to them. They had accepted a young black man into their exclusive inner circle for one reason and one reason only. They desperately wanted my land. If I refused to hand it over, they would throw my son out on the street before the ink on his marriage certificate was even dry. He would lose the glamorous high society life he had completely sold his soul to achieve. They thought I was a desperate, lonely old man who would do absolutely anything to keep his only son from cutting him off forever. They thought the sudden public humiliation of the shaved head would permanently break my spirit and make me completely compliant. They thought the heavy social pressure of the wealthy crowd would force my hand to sign on the dotted line. They had absolutely no idea that the quiet man sitting in the back of the room staring at their fraudulent contract was not a struggling, exhausted contractor. They did not know I was the anonymous founder and absolute majority shareholder of Vanguard Equities, a shadow titan in the commercial real estate world. I did not panic. I did not shed a tear. I simply folded the aggressive contract back up and placed it neatly on the table in front of me. I slipped my hand silently into the pocket of my cheap beige suit and wrapped my fingers firmly around my cell phone. The Kensingtons wanted a financial transaction to secure their legacy. I was going to give them a total financial slaughter. I slipped away from my small table near the kitchen doors, leaving the heavy folded contract sitting next to my glass of ice water. The wealthy guests were too busy sipping expensive champagne and laughing at their own arrogant jokes to notice the bald old man blending into the shadows. I pushed through the swinging wooden doors and stepped into the stark fluorescent lighting of the service hallway. The vibrant music of the string quartet instantly faded behind me, replaced by the frantic energy of caterers rushing plates of food back and forth. I ignored them completely, walking with absolute purpose down a narrow corridor that the wealthy club members were never allowed to see. I stopped in front of a heavy, reinforced steel door at the very end of the hall. There was no sign on the outside, just a small digital keypad. I did not bother to knock. I punched in a 6-digit override code that only 2 people in the entire world possessed. The heavy lock clicked, and I pushed the door open, stepping into the cool, dark, climate-controlled nerve center of the Oak Ridge Country Club security room. A massive wall of glowing surveillance monitors illuminated the dark space. Sitting in front of the screens was Marcus, the head of club security. Marcus was a broad-shouldered black man in his late 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes. 10 years ago, Marcus was facing a trumped-up felony charge that would have ruined his life because he defended his sister from a wealthy drunk driver. I quietly paid for the best defense attorney in the state to clear his name and gave him a job when nobody else would look at his resume. He had been fiercely loyal to me ever since. Marcus stood up immediately when I walked in. He looked at my shaved head and the fresh, angry scratches on my scalp, and his jaw tightened instantly. He knew exactly what had just happened in the VIP lounge. He stepped aside, gesturing to the heavy leather control chair in the center of the room. He did not ask any questions. He simply said, "The room is yours, Mr. Holloway." I sat down in the leather chair and stared at the wall of glowing monitors. The Kensington family strutted around this country club like they owned the very air they were breathing. They demanded the best tables, they treated the service staff like absolute garbage, and they looked down their noses at anyone who did not share their pale complexion and their generational wealth. They thought I was just a pathetic, broke contractor who had somehow managed to sneak into their pristine white world. They were completely wrong. What Richard Kensington and the rest of the arrogant elite did not know was that the Oak Ridge Country Club had quietly faced total bankruptcy 3 years ago. To save their precious sanctuary from public foreclosure, the board of directors had secretly sold a massive 80% controlling stake to a faceless private equity firm called Vanguard Equities. They had absolutely no idea that Vanguard Equities was fully owned and operated by the same black man they had just held down and shaved like a common criminal. I did not just have a membership at this club. I owned the grass they played golf on. I owned the marble floors they danced on. I owned every single camera currently recording their every move. "Marcus," I said, my voice low and dangerous, "bring up the visual and audio feeds for the private bridal suite. Pull it up on the main center screen right now." Marcus typed rapidly on his keyboard. Technically, monitoring the audio in a private guest suite was highly illegal, but I did not care about the privacy of monsters. A second later, the large center monitor flickered to life. The high-definition camera hidden inside a smoke detector gave me a perfect crystal-clear view of the luxurious room. Richard Kensington and his daughter Chloe were inside the suite, but they were not celebrating. They were completely falling apart. Richard was pacing frantically back and forth across the expensive Persian rug. His custom tuxedo jacket was thrown carelessly onto a chair, and his bow tie was pulled loose. He was sweating profusely, running his trembling hands through his hair. Chloe was sitting on the edge of a velvet sofa, biting her perfectly manicured nails down to the quick, looking like a terrified child instead of a glowing bride. The polished, arrogant masks they wore in the ballroom had completely melted away, revealing the desperate, cornered animals underneath. "It is all falling apart. Chloe." Richard paced, his voice panicked and breathless. "The federal investigators raided our downtown offices this morning. They took the hard drives. They took the financial ledgers. We are out of time." Chloe stood up, her hands shaking violently. "Dad, you promised me you had this under control," she pleaded, her voice shrill with terror. "You said the new investors would cover the deficits. You said nobody would ever find out about the missing funds. There are no new investors, Chloe." Richard yelled back, losing his temper entirely. "Do you not understand what is happening? The Kensington Group is completely empty. It is a shell. We have been using new investor money to pay off the old investor returns for 5 years. It is a textbook Ponzi scheme, and the music has finally stopped. We owe $30 million in toxic shadow loans, and the banks are initiating total foreclosure on Monday morning. If we do not secure new collateral before the banks open, I am going to federal prison, and you will be living on the street. I leaned forward in the dark security room, resting my elbows on the control desk. The truth was finally laid bare. The mighty Kensington dynasty was nothing but a massive criminal fraud. They were drowning in a $30 million ocean of toxic debt, and they were desperately searching for a life raft to keep them from sinking to the bottom. And that life raft was my land. That 50 acres of undeveloped commercial zoning just outside the city was the only hard, unencumbered asset they could possibly get their hands on. They needed my signature to transfer the deed to their company so they could walk into the bank on Monday morning and use my family legacy as collateral to secure a massive survival loan. They did not want my son. They wanted my dirt to save their miserable criminal lives. The door to the bridal suite suddenly opened on the monitor. Julian walked in looking anxious, holding a glass of champagne. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the sheer panic on the faces of his new wife and father-in-law. "What is going on?" Julian asked, his voice wavering nervously. "The guests are asking for you. We need to go back down for the speeches." Richard crossed the room in 3 long strides and grabbed Julian by the lapels of his white tuxedo. He backed my son up against the heavy wooden door, shaking him violently. "Forget the guests," Richard hissed, his face inches from Julian. "Did you get the signature? Did your pathetic father sign the transfer deed yet?" Julian stammered, trying to pull away from Richard's aggressive grip. "I gave him the contract. Chloe gave it to him. He is looking at it right now. I will make sure he signs it when we call him up to the stage. I promise, Richard. He will not embarrass me again. He better not." Richard growled, releasing his grip and smoothing out Julian's jacket with a rough, patronizing pat. "Because if we do not get that land tonight, you have absolutely no future in this family. You are going to force the old man to sign that paper tonight, Julian. Do whatever it takes. Threaten him, humiliate him, break his spirit. I do not care." Julian swallowed hard, looking down at the floor. He was a coward trapped in a cage he had built for himself. "But what do I do with him after he signs?" Julian asked softly. "He is going to keep coming around. He is going to ask questions about the property." Richard let out a cold, soulless laugh. He reached out and grabbed the back of Julian's neck, pulling him close to deliver the killing blow. "You are not going to have to worry about him ever again," Richard whispered, his voice dripping with pure evil. "Once we have the land legally secured next month, you are going to throw him in some cheap state-run nursing home. You will cut off all contact and change your numbers. We have lawyers who specialize in this. We will forge the medical paperwork to declare him mentally incompetent and lock him away for the rest of his miserable life. He will disappear, and we will be saved." I watched the monitor, holding my breath. I waited for my son to fight back. I waited for the boy I had raised to realize he was standing in a room full of monsters. I waited for him to defend the father who had bled for him. Julian looked up. He looked at Chloe, who was staring at him with desperate, pleading eyes. Then he looked at Richard. Julian nodded his head slowly. "Whatever it takes," Julian said, his voice devoid of any human emotion. "I will get him to sign it, and then we will get rid of him." In the dark security room, Marcus let out a heavy, shocked breath beside me. I did not move a single muscle. I did not blink. I just stared at the glowing screen, watching my own flesh and blood agree to throw me away like human garbage to save a family of white-collar criminals. The last shred of paternal love I held in my heart instantly turned to ash. My eyes locked onto the monitor, turning as cold and hard as solid ice. The Kensingtons wanted to play a game of absolute destruction, but they had no idea that the man they were trying to bury was the very person who owned the shovel. On my son's wedding day, he looked me dead in the eye, called me an embarrassment, and shaved my head in front of his wealthy new family. He thought he was erasing my dignity to fit into his new high society life. The entire room fell silent. I stood there, humiliated but quiet. I did not scream. I did not fight back. I just watched my hair fall to the floor. But what I did exactly 2 hours later brought his entire millionaire wedding crashing down on the most important day of his life. I left the dark sanctuary of the security room and made my way back through the bustling kitchen corridors. The heavy swinging doors pushed open, and the blinding light of the grand ballroom hit my face once again. The official reception was in full swing. Waiters in crisp white uniforms were pouring vintage champagne into crystal flutes. The 300 VIP guests were taking their seats, their expensive jewelry sparkling under the massive chandeliers. I slipped quietly back into my chair at the small, isolated table near the rear exit. I smoothed the lapels of my cheap polyester suit. My bare scalp still stung where Julian had carelessly dug the electric clippers into my skin, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the absolute clarity that had just settled over my mind. I was no longer a heartbroken father. I was a predator patiently waiting in the tall grass. The string quartet faded out, replaced by the sharp ringing of a silver spoon tapping against a glass. The room fell into a hushed, expectant silence. Julian stood at the center of the lavishly decorated stage holding a microphone. His white custom tuxedo practically glowed under the stage lights. Chloe stood right beside him, her hand resting possessively on his arm. They looked like the perfect, wealthy, untouchable couple. Julian cleared his throat, putting on that polished, engineered smile he had learned from his new family. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Tonight is about more than just a wedding. It is about the merging of two worlds. It is about elevation." He paused dramatically, looking out over the sea of wealthy investors, politicians, and real estate moguls. "Growing up, I did not have much." Julian continued, his tone shifting into a carefully rehearsed faux humility. "I came from a very simple, very basic background. I was taught that you just keep your head down and accept your lot in life. I was surrounded by a mindset of limitation. But then I met the Kensington family." Julian turned and smiled warmly at Richard Kensington, who was sitting at the head table looking like a proud mafia boss. "Richard took me under his wing," Julian proclaimed, his voice dripping with sycophantic devotion. "He showed me what true ambition looks like. He taught me that family is not just about where you come from, but about the legacy you choose to build." The Kensingtons welcomed me into their home. They became the parents I always needed. They showed me how to rise above the dirt. A collective murmur of approval rippled through the ballroom. The wealthy white guests nodded, exchanging approving glances. They loved a good charity story. They loved the narrative of the generous elite saving the poor, ambitious minority from his own bleak origins. Every single word out of my son's mouth was a calculated, deliberate insult to my entire existence. He was standing on a stage, implicitly calling my decades of backbreaking labor a mindset of limitation. He was publicly disowning my blood to appease a room full of strangers. I sat in the back, my face perfectly blank, sipping my ice water. Let him talk, I thought. Let him dig the hole as deep as he possibly can. When Julian finished his sickening speech, the crowd erupted into polite applause. But the performance was far from over. Richard Kensington stood up from his chair, buttoning his imported suit jacket, and walked confidently up the steps to the stage. He took the microphone from Julian and raised his hands to quiet the room. "What a beautiful sentiment," Richard announced, his voice booming with false warmth. "And Julian is absolutely right. Tonight is about merging our legacies. But we are not just merging our hearts. We believe in building a concrete, tangible future for these two young people, and that requires a symbolic gesture of absolute unity." Richard's eyes scanned the massive ballroom, sweeping over the hundreds of guests until his gaze locked directly onto me, sitting alone in the shadows. "We are honored to have Julian Father Desmond with us tonight," Richard said loudly. I felt 300 pairs of eyes instantly pivot in my direction. The spotlight swung around, illuminating my isolated table, exposing my cheap beige suit and my freshly shaved, scratched head to the entire room. The sheer psychological pressure they were deploying was staggering. They were using the crushing weight of the elite crowd to pin me down. "Desmond, my friend, please come up here," Richard commanded, gesturing to the stage with a sweeping theatrical motion. "Tonight, Desmond has agreed to officially sign the family asset merger, a generous wedding gift that will permanently unite our properties and secure Julian place in the Kensington dynasty. Please let us give this humble man a warm round of applause." The guests began to clap. It was a slow, patronizing applause. They were expecting a broken, intimidated old man to scurry up to the stage and surrender whatever meager belongings he had to his wealthy superiors. They were expecting a slaughter. I did not rush. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. The cool air conditioning brushed against the small raw cuts on my scalp. Every step I took toward the stage was deliberate and measured. I walked past tables of venture capitalists who looked at me with thinly veiled disgust. I walked past socialites who whispered behind their hands. I kept my posture straight, my eyes fixed entirely on the men waiting for me on the stage. When I climbed the short wooden steps, Chloe stepped forward, holding the thick leather-bound folder she had thrown at me earlier. She placed it carefully on a small display podium set up in the center of the stage. Richard stood next to her holding a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. Julian stood a few feet away, his jaw clenched, his eyes glaring at me with a silent, intense threat. He was warning me not to embarrass him. He was warning me to submit. I stepped up to the podium and looked down at the document. There it was, the absolute transfer of 50 hectares of prime commercial real estate, completely signing away my family legacy to the Kensington Group. A piece of land worth tens of millions of dollars, the exact asset they desperately needed to save themselves from a $30 million federal bankruptcy on Monday morning. Richard held the gold pen out to me. His smile was razor thin, a shark baring its teeth. "Just sign on the dotted line, Desmond," he whispered so softly the microphone could not pick it up. "Sign it, and you can go back to your miserable little life. Refuse, and your son is out on the street tonight." I took the heavy pen from his hand. The cold metal felt smooth against my rough, calloused fingers. I looked at Julian one last time. I stared directly into the eyes of the boy I had raised, silently offering him one final, ultimate chance to stop this. One chance to be a man. One chance to defend his own father. Julian did not blink. He just gave a sharp, aggressive nod toward the paper, essentially ordering me to sign my own execution order. The last invisible thread of my paternal mercy completely snapped. I looked down at the crisp white paper. The Kensingtons thought they were dealing with Desmond Holloway, the retired, uneducated construction worker. They did not know that 40 years ago, when I first bought that massive 50-hectare plot of land, I did not register it under my own name. I had registered it under a highly protected, anonymous shell corporation called Horizon Builders Incorporated. I pressed the gold nib of the pen against the signature line. I did not write my legal name. I deliberately scrawled a messy, completely unrecognizable signature that vaguely resembled the word Horizon. But a signature alone in commercial real estate transfers can be contested. It needed an official corporate seal to finalize the illusion. I reached into the pocket of my cheap beige suit. I pulled out a small, heavy brass stamp and a miniature ink pad. Richard raised an eyebrow, looking slightly confused by the old-fashioned gesture. "I am an old-school contractor, Richard," I whispered, keeping my voice low and perfectly calm. "I like to make my agreements official." I pressed the brass stamp into the dark ink and slammed it down hard next to the messy signature. The red ink bloomed beautifully against the white page. The stamp read Horizon Builders Incorporated. What Richard, Kensington, Chloe, and Julian did not know was that Horizon Builders Incorporated was a company I had legally, publicly, and permanently dissolved in a bankruptcy filing exactly 5 years ago. The corporate entity no longer existed in the eyes of the law. The signature was a deliberate fake. The corporate seal belonged to a ghost. I had just signed a multi-million-dollar transfer using the identity of a dead company. The heavy, impressive document sitting on that podium was absolutely legally worthless. It was nothing but a stack of expensive garbage. Before I could even put my brass stamp away, Richard snatched the folder off the podium with greedy lightning speed. He did not even bother to look closely at the signature or the stamp. He just saw the red ink and assumed he had won. He snapped the leather folder shut and clutched it against his chest like it was a life preserver. A massive, triumphant smile spread across Richard's face. He turned to the crowd and raised the folder high in the air. The crowd erupted into a loud, celebratory cheer. Chloe beamed, wrapping her arms around Julian's neck and kissing his cheek. Julian let out a massive, visible sigh of relief, completely believing his position in high society was permanently secured. They stood there on the stage, bathed in the bright lights and the applause of their wealthy peers, smiling like they had just conquered the world. They had absolutely no idea that the piece of paper they were holding was a one-way ticket to federal prison. They thought they had just stolen my empire. In reality, they had just given me the exact amount of time I needed to initiate their total, catastrophic destruction. I set the gold pen down on the empty podium, turned my back on my son, and calmly walked off the stage. The trap had been swallowed whole. Now it was time to detonate the bomb. I stepped down from the wooden stage, leaving the fraudulent document resting on the display podium. The wealthy crowd had already turned their attention away from me, lifting their expensive champagne glasses to toast the newlyweds. To them, the brief, uncomfortable charity case was over. The poor old black man had surrendered his dirt and could now be dismissed. I walked slowly toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom, feeling the cool air conditioning brush against my completely bare, scratched scalp. Before I could even reach the exit, a hand clamped down hard on my shoulder. I did not have to turn around to know it was Julian. He pulled me slightly into the shadows of a large floral arrangement out of sight of his new elite family. "You can leave now, Julian," hissed his voice, tight and completely devoid of any human warmth. "You did your part. The driver is waiting for you at the service exit. Go straight to the car and do not talk to anyone on your way out. I will call you next week to arrange the collection of your things from the house." I looked at the young man standing in front of me. He was wearing a custom white tuxedo that cost more than my first car. I remembered holding him when he was a baby, promising his mother Vivian that I would break my back to give him the world. I had kept that promise. I gave him the world, and he traded it for a cheap illusion of white high society. He was looking at me with pure, unadulterated embarrassment. He wanted me to vanish through the service doors like the hired help so he could go back to playing his pretend role. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to remind him that he was speaking to the father who had bled for him. I simply gave him a slow, deliberate nod. "Enjoy your wedding, Julian," I said, my voice lower and colder than the ice in his glass. I turned my back on my only son and walked through the heavy swinging doors, leaving the bright lights of the ballroom behind me. The service corridor was a completely different world. It was a chaotic maze of stainless steel, shouting chefs and waiters rushing by with massive silver trays. I blended right in. To the staff, I just looked like another working-class old man who had gotten lost trying to find the restroom. But I was not lost. I knew the blueprints of the Oak Ridge Country Club better than the architect who designed it because I had quietly financed its massive renovation 3 years ago. I did not walk toward the service exit where Julian Driver was supposedly waiting to carry me away in shame. Instead, I navigated through the bustling kitchen, stepping past the massive industrial ovens and the towering racks of fine china. I walked down a narrow, dimly lit hallway reserved exclusively for executive staff and stopped in front of a heavy, unmarked steel door. I punched in a silent security code and stepped into the private logistics office. Standing by the large wooden desk, waiting in the absolute silence of the soundproof room, was Maxine. Maxine was not just a lawyer. She was a weapon of mass destruction wrapped in a flawless, tailored suit. She was a brilliant, ruthless 35-year-old black woman who had graduated at the top of her class from Harvard Law. The elite corporate firms downtown had tried to recruit her for years, but she chose to work exclusively for Vanguard Equities. She chose to work for me because I let her take the gloves completely off when dealing with corrupt billionaires who thought they owned the world. Maxine looked up from her tablet as I walked in. Her sharp, calculating eyes immediately went to my shaved head. She saw the raw, red scratches on my scalp. Her jaw locked instantly, a muscle ticking in her cheek. She knew exactly what Julian and Richard Kensington had done to me. She knew how much my traditional hair meant to me and my late wife. Maxine did not offer empty sympathy or pathetic words of comfort. She knew I did not want pity. I wanted a slaughter. "Are we ready?" I asked, my voice echoing in the quiet office. Maxine nodded, sliding a sleek black leather briefcase across the desk. She clicked the metal clasps open, revealing a mountain of highly confidential financial documents. "More than ready, boss," she said, her voice dripping with a lethal professional calm. "I have the entire financial autopsy of the Kensington Group right here in this folder." I stepped up to the desk and looked down at the papers. The mighty Kensington real estate dynasty was a rotting corpse propped up by stolen money. Richard Kensington had spent the last 5 years running a massive Ponzi scheme, moving money from new investors to pay off the old ones, buying yachts and mansions while his company bled to death from the inside out. But the banks had finally caught on. Legitimate lenders had completely cut him off. In his absolute desperation to keep up his wealthy facade, Richard had turned to the shadow banking sector. He had borrowed $30 million from dangerous, unregulated private equity firms and organized crime syndicates. He was completely drowning, and those dangerous men were coming to collect their money on Monday morning. That was exactly why he desperately needed my land to use as fake collateral to save his own skin. I looked at Maxine, the cold rage inside me solidifying into absolute focus. "I do not want to wait until Monday," I instructed, my tone flat and uncompromising. "I want Vanguard Equities to buy all $30 million of the Kensington bad debt tonight, right now. Contact the shadow lenders immediately. Offer them a 15% premium to sell the paper to us in cash." Maxine's lips curled into a sharp, predatory smile. "Buying their debt at a premium will cost a fortune, boss," she noted, though her fingers were already flying across the screen of her encrypted tablet to draft the urgent acquisition orders. "I do not care what it costs," I replied, staring at the financial ledgers. "I have spent my entire life saving my money in the shadows. Tonight, I am spending it to destroy theirs. I want to hold the absolute legal rights to their entire existence. I want to own the mortgage on their estate, the liens on their cars, and the very breath in their lungs. Make sure the transfer is finalized and legally binding before they even think about cutting that ridiculously expensive wedding cake out there." "Consider it done," Maxine said, tapping the final confirmation on her screen. "It will take 20 minutes to clear the international wires. They will not even know what hit them." I nodded, adjusting the cuffs of my cheap beige suit. The trap was fully loaded. Julian thought he had erased me. Richard thought he had saved himself. They had no idea that the silent old man they just humiliated had just purchased the legal right to completely eradicate their future. I turned to leave the office, intending to walk back into the shadows of the grand ballroom and watch my arrogant new family celebrate their last moments of freedom. But before my hand could even touch the brass doorknob, Maxine spoke up. "Wait, boss," she said, her tone suddenly shifting from corporate triumph to a dark, urgent warning. "There is one more thing you need to hear before you go back out there." I stopped and turned around. Maxine reached into the inside pocket of her tailored blazer and pulled out a small, sleek digital recording device. She placed it carefully on the wooden desk and offered a cold, knowing smile. "As the majority owners of this country club, you authorized us to install hidden security microphones in the private VIP suites," Maxine explained, her eyes narrowing with absolute disgust. 10 minutes ago, the system flagged a conversation between Richard Kensington and his senior partners inside the bridal suite. "You need to listen to this." I walked back to the desk. Maxine pressed the play button. The audio was crystal clear. It was Richard Kensington's voice, breathless and vibrating with greedy excitement. "Listen to me," Richard was saying on the recording, his words slurred slightly from the expensive scotch. "The old black guy just signed the land over. It is ours, but the land is just the collateral for the banks on Monday. We need liquid cash right now to keep the feds off our backs this weekend. All of the biggest venture capitalists in the state are sitting out there in the ballroom right now drinking my champagne. Tonight we launch the Green Horizon Initiative. We tell them we are building a state-of-the-art exclusive eco-resort on the newly acquired 50-hectare property. We open the floor for exclusive invite-only seed funding. They are drunk, they are happy, and they trust me. We can easily collect $10 million in personal checks before midnight." Another voice on the recording, one of his corrupt partners, chimed in nervously. "But Richard, we do not have permits for an eco-resort. We do not have blueprints. The whole project is completely imaginary. I do not care if it is imaginary." Richard laughed a cold, psychopathic sound. "By the time those rich idiots realize there is no resort, we will have moved the cash to the offshore accounts in the Caymans. We take their money tonight, we let the old man take the fall for the fraudulent land deed next week, and we walk away totally clean." The recording clicked off, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the logistics office. My jaw locked so tight my teeth ground together. Richard Kensington was not just a desperate businessman trying to save his sinking ship. He was a relentless predator. He was using my wedding. He was using my supposed land, and he was using the trust of his own wealthy peers to execute the final, most devastating stage of his Ponzi scheme. He was going to rob 300 people blind while his daughter danced in her wedding dress. Maxine crossed her arms, looking at me with a lethal calmness. "He is about to turn your wedding into the biggest financial crime scene in the history of Atlanta," she said quietly. "He is not just defrauding the bank's boss. He is planning to scam all 300 VIP guests out there tonight right before they cut the cake." On my wedding day, he looked me dead in the eye, called me an embarrassment, and shaved my head in front of his wealthy new family. He thought he was erasing my dignity to fit into his new high society life. The entire room fell silent. I stood there, humiliated but quiet. I did not scream. I did not fight back. I just watched my hair fall to the floor. But what I did exactly 2 hours later brought his entire millionaire wedding crashing down on the most important day of his life. I stared at the small digital recorder resting on the heavy wooden desk. The glowing red light blinked in the dim logistics office, echoing the steady mechanical rhythm of my own heartbeat. Richard Kensington was not just a desperate man trying to plug a $30 million hole in his sinking ship. He was a ravenous parasite. He was planning to use the fake transfer document I had just signed to legitimize a completely fabricated eco-resort, and he was going to use his daughter's wedding reception to bleed his own wealthy friends dry. I looked up at Maxine. Her sharp eyes were locked onto mine, waiting for the green light. She knew I had a zero-tolerance policy for thieves who wore tailored suits and hid behind corporate charity galas. "You have exactly 30 minutes, Maxine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of an absolute mandate. "Push the 15% premium to the shadow lenders immediately. Tell them Vanguard Equities wants the entire Kensington debt portfolio finalized and legally transferred to our holding accounts before the clock strikes 9. I do not care what financial backdoors you have to kick open to make it happen. I want to hold the deed to Richard Kensington's miserable life before they cut that ridiculously expensive wedding cake out there." Maxine did not smile, but a dangerous, predatory glint flashed in her dark eyes. "Consider them already dead, boss," she replied, her fingers immediately flying across the encrypted tablet to initiate the massive wire transfers. "I will text you the second we hold the absolute legal authority to execute the foreclosure." I nodded, once turned my back on the logistics office and pushed back through the heavy swinging doors into the grand ballroom. The air conditioning immediately hit the raw, stinging scratches on my freshly shaved scalp, a physical reminder of the ultimate disrespect I had endured just an hour ago. But the humiliation was entirely gone. It had been completely burned away, replaced by the cold, sterile focus of an executioner stepping onto the scaffold. I walked quietly along the perimeter of the room, keeping to the shadows cast by the towering floral arrangements. I returned to my small, isolated table near the rear exit and sat down in the dark. From this vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire ballroom. It was like watching a perfectly choreographed wildlife documentary, except the predators were wearing imported silk and drinking vintage champagne. I watched Richard Kensington working the room. He was a master of his disgusting craft. He moved gracefully from table to table, clapping state senators on the shoulder, kissing the cheeks of wealthy socialites, and leaning in to whisper conspiratorially into the ears of tech CEOs and venture capitalists. He was selling them the ghost. He was pitching the Green Horizon Initiative, the state-of-the-art eco-resort he claimed he was going to build on my 50 hectares of land. The land he thought he had just stolen from a naive, uneducated black contractor. I watched, absolutely fascinated by the sheer audacity of human greed, as checkbooks literally began to appear on the silk tablecloths. I saw men in $10,000 tuxedos hastily writing personal checks for $500,000, desperate to get in on the ground floor of Kensington exclusive new venture. Richard was collecting millions of dollars in fraudulent investments, while the string quartet played a cheerful symphony in the background. It was a breathtaking, horrifying display of high society cannibalism. Then my eyes drifted to the sweetheart table in the center of the room. Julian sat there next to his glowing bride, laughing loudly at a joke someone had just told. He was holding a crystal flute of champagne, soaking in the admiration of the elite crowd. He genuinely thought he had finally arrived. He thought he had successfully shed the heavy working-class skin of his past and secured his permanent place among the untouchable royalty of the city. He did not realize that the royal family he had married into was nothing but a cartel of bankrupt frauds, and that he was sitting right at the epicenter of a massive federal crime scene. I remembered sitting on the edge of Julian's bed when he was 10 years old. I remembered showing him how to tie a Windsor knot with a cheap tie I had bought from a discount store. I told him that day that a man is only as good as his word, and that real respect is earned through sweat, honesty, and protecting the people who stand behind you. I had worked until the cartilage in my knees deteriorated just to pay for the elite education I thought would make him a leader. Instead, that education had taught him how to despise the very hands that fed him. He traded his soul for a seat at a table that was currently resting on quicksand. Suddenly, the loud, arrogant laughter stopped. Julian had turned his head and his eyes locked directly onto mine across the massive expanse of the ballroom. His smile instantly vanished, replaced by a dark, furious scowl. He set his champagne glass down so hard the crystal nearly shattered. He whispered something hurried to Chloe, stood up from the sweetheart table, and began marching furiously toward the back of the room. He navigated through the maze of tables, his face flushed with alcohol and unadulterated rage. He did not care if a few guests noticed his sudden aggressive demeanor. All he cared about was the fact that the human stain on his perfect evening had not been properly scrubbed away. He reached my table and did not even bother to lower his voice. "What the hell are you still doing here?" Julian hissed, stepping directly into my personal space. Before I could even blink, my son reached out and grabbed the lapels of my cheap beige suit. He bunched the coarse polyester fabric in his fists and physically jerked me upward, leaning his face so close to mine I could smell the expensive liquor on his breath. It was the ultimate unforgivable transgression. A son laying his violent hands on the father who gave him life. "I told you to get out!" Julian spat his eyes wide with frantic, hateful panic. "The driver has been waiting at the loading dock for an hour. Are you completely insane? Are you trying to ruin the most important night of my life? How much more do you want to humiliate me? You signed the paper. You gave them the dirt. You are done here. Get the hell out of my sight before I have security throw you out onto the street." I did not raise my hands to break his grip. I did not flinch. I did not try to pull away. I stood perfectly still, letting him hold me by the collar. I looked him dead in the eye. I stripped away every single ounce of paternal warmth, every shred of forgiveness, and every memory of the boy I used to love. I let him look into the eyes of the ruthless anonymous titan who had systematically devoured corporate empires in the shadows for 3 decades. The temperature in the air between us seemed to plummet to absolute zero. Julian felt the sudden terrifying shift. The arrogant fury in his eyes began to waver, slowly replaced by a creeping, icy confusion. He was expecting the tired, defeated old man he had bullied in the lounge. He was not prepared for the dead, soulless stare of a predator locking onto its prey. "I am waiting to see the cake-cutting son," I said. My voice was quiet, perfectly measured, and completely devoid of any emotion. It did not shake. It cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom like a surgical scalpel. Julian frowned, his grip loosening just a fraction in his sheer bewilderment. "The cake cutting," he repeated, genuinely confused by my terrifyingly calm response. "What are you talking about?" I kept my eyes locked onto his, watching the exact moment the primal fear began to register in his pupils, because right after that I whispered, leaning in just a fraction of an inch closer to his face, "I am going to cut your umbilical cord." Julian breath hitched in his throat. He slowly released my lapels, his hands trembling slightly as they dropped back to his sides. He took a hesitant step backward, suddenly realizing that he had absolutely no idea who the man standing in front of him truly was. The polished, arrogant groom had just looked into an abyss, and the abyss was staring right back. The grandfather clock in the grand hallway struck 9. The deep chimes echoed faintly through the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom. I sat completely still in the shadows of the rear exit. The cheap polyester fabric of my beige suit clung to my skin in the warm air of the crowded room. Then I felt it, a sharp vibration against my thigh. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my calloused hands in the dark. It was a single text message from Maxine. It read, "Vanguard Equities has successfully acquired 100% of the Kensington Group debt portfolio. Immediate foreclosure rights are now active due to the explicit violation of the fraud clause. Proceed at your discretion, boss." I read the words twice. The letters on the screen glowed like a loaded weapon. $30 million of toxic debt was now completely under my control. I did not just own their business. I owned their mansion. I owned their luxury cars. I owned the very rings on their fingers. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket. The anger that had been simmering in my chest all day suddenly cooled into a solid block of absolute freezing ice. The waiting was over. The execution was scheduled. At the very front of the ballroom, the music swelled to a triumphant crescendo. A team of waiters in pristine white gloves carefully wheeled out a massive 6-tier wedding cake decorated with edible gold leaf and white roses. The crowd gasped and applauded politely. Julian and Chloe stood next to the towering cake, holding hands and beaming with arrogant pride. Chloe looked like royalty in her designer gown. Julian, my own flesh and blood, looked completely intoxicated by the wealth surrounding him. He puffed out his chest, standing tall, believing he had finally secured his permanent seat at the table of the elite. He thought he had successfully traded his father for a lifetime of luxury. Richard Kensington stepped up to the center microphone. He held a crystal flute of vintage champagne high in the air, catching the light of the massive chandeliers. He flashed his $1 million smile at the audience of venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and state politicians. "My dear friends," Richard announced, his voice booming with fake charm. "Before we cut this beautiful cake and celebrate the union of my daughter and my brilliant new son-in-law, I have a historic announcement to make. Thanks to the monumental addition of the 50-hectare commercial property we secured tonight, The Kensington Group is officially launching the Green Horizon Initiative. Richard paused, letting the greedy anticipation build in the room. He leaned into the microphone, lowering his voice to sound exclusive and conspiratorial. This is going to be the premier eco-resort of the entire southern United States, he lied smoothly. And because we value our inner circle, I am opening the seed funding round tonight exclusively to the people in this room. $10 million is all we need to break ground. Our associates are walking around the tables right now to collect your early investment checks. Get in tonight, my friends, because by Monday morning the door will be permanently closed. The wealthy guests practically tripped over themselves, reaching into their tailored tuxedo jackets for their checkbooks. They were completely blinded by the illusion of Richard Kensington. They were handing over millions of dollars to a man who was legally bankrupt. I watched them signing away their money. I watched Julian smiling proudly as his new father-in-law orchestrated a massive federal crime using the land he thought he had stolen from me. I placed my hands flat on the small table and pushed myself up. I did not slouch my shoulders anymore. I stood at my full, intimidating height. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the heavy, scented air of the ballroom. I stepped out of the shadows and began walking straight down the center aisle. My heavy footsteps moved in perfect rhythm. The guests sitting at the tables near the aisle started to notice me. The conversation slowly died out again. The same people who had looked at me with pity and disgust an hour ago were now staring at me in total confusion. They saw the bald, scratched head of the man who was supposed to be hiding in shame, but the man walking past them was not broken. I moved with the heavy, unstoppable momentum of a freight train. My eyes were locked dead onto the stage, focusing entirely on Richard Kensington. Richard was smiling, taking a folded check from a wealthy tech executive when he saw me marching down the aisle. His smile froze instantly. His eyes widened in sudden angry panic. He leaned back and gave a sharp, subtle nod to his two personal security guards standing near the edge of the stage. These were massive men wearing dark suits and earpieces, hired specifically to protect the Kensington family from any unwanted disruptions. The two Kensington guards moved quickly, stepping directly into my path to block the stairs leading up to the stage. One of them reached out a massive hand to grab me by the shoulder. "You need to turn around and walk away right now before we drag you out of here," the guard growled aggressively. I did not stop walking. I did not even slow down. I just kept my eyes fixed on Richard. Before the Kensington guard could even touch the fabric of my cheap beige suit, the shadows around the stage suddenly burst into violent motion. Marcus, the head of the Oak Ridge Country Club security, stepped out from behind a heavy velvet curtain, followed instantly by 4 of his elite tactical officers. These were my men. They were highly trained, deeply loyal, and they answered to absolutely no one but Vanguard Equities. The takedown was completely silent and brutally efficient. Marcus lunged forward, grabbing the first Kensington guard by the wrist, twisting his arm sharply behind his back and forcing him to his knees on the hard marble floor. The other country club officers swarmed the second guard, sweeping his legs out from under him and pinning him face down against the ground. It happened so fast, the wealthy guests sitting in the front row gasped in pure shock, spilling their expensive champagne. Richard Kensington dropped his glass. It shattered against the wooden stage. He looked down at his elite private security team currently immobilized and groveling on the floor. He looked up at Marcus, expecting the country club security to protect the wealthy members. But Marcus simply stood guard at the bottom of the stairs, staring at Richard with absolute lethal authority, making it crystal clear that he was acting on my direct orders. I walked past the subdued guards without giving them a single glance. I placed my heavy work boots on the wooden steps and climbed up onto the stage. Julian stood next to the wedding cake, his face completely drained of color. He looked like a terrified child. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Chloe was clutching his arm, her eyes darting wildly between her father and the men pinned on the floor. I walked right up to Richard Kensington. We were standing chest to chest. I could smell the panic radiating off his sweating skin. He opened his mouth to scream for help, but I moved faster. I reached out and snatched the heavy metal microphone right out of his trembling hand. I brought the microphone close to my mouth. A loud, piercing screech of audio feedback blasted through the massive speakers, echoing violently across the entire ballroom. The sudden, deafening noise made hundreds of billionaires and socialites cover their ears and shrink back in their seats. The entire room fell into an absolute, terrified silence. I looked out at the sea of wealthy faces, then turned my cold, dead eyes back to Richard Kensington. Sorry to interrupt the theater, I said, my voice echoing like thunder through the silent room, but I have an announcement from the creditor. On my son's wedding day, he looked me dead in the eye, called me an embarrassment, and shaved my head in front of his wealthy new family. He thought he was erasing my dignity to fit into his new high society life. The entire room fell silent. I stood there humiliated but quiet. I did not scream. I did not fight back. I just watched my hair fall to the floor. But what I did exactly 2 hours later brought his entire millionaire wedding crashing down on the most important day of his life. Richard's face turned a violent shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight silk collar. "What the hell are you doing?" he screamed, spit flying from his lips. He looked frantically past the stage toward the sound booth at the back of the room. "Cut his microphone. Turn it off right now. Get this crazy old man off my stage." But the sound engineer did not touch a single dial. The sound engineer worked for the Oak Ridge Country Club, and tonight everyone in this building answered to me. The microphone remained perfectly hot. Julian saw his new father-in-law panicking. He saw his fragile, fake royal lifestyle slipping through his fingers. He panicked. My own son lunged forward, stepping away from his beautiful bride and his expensive wedding cake. He charged at me with his hands outstretched, ready to physically rip the metal microphone from my grip. He wanted to silence me to protect the thieves who had bought his loyalty. I did not back away. I simply raised my left hand and pointed a single calloused finger directly at his face. "Stop right there, Julian," I said. My voice did not yell, but it echoed through the speakers with a terrifying, heavy gravity. "Take one more step and I will have my security team break both of your legs in front of your new wife." Julian froze. His expensive leather shoes stopped dead on the wooden floorboards. He looked at my finger, and then he looked into my eyes. For his entire life, he had only known me as the quiet, exhausted contractor who came home smelling of concrete and drywall. He had never seen the man who ruthlessly dismantled corporate empires. He had never seen the monster I kept chained up in the dark. The sheer lethal intent radiating from my eyes paralyzed him completely. He looked past my shoulder and saw Marcus and the tactical security officers taking a synchronized step forward, ready to snap his bones if I gave the command. Julian swallowed hard, his hands dropping limply to his sides. He shrank back, cowering like a frightened child. I turned my back on my pathetic son. I faced the 300 wealthy guests sitting in the grand ballroom. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. The venture capitalists, the hedge fund managers, and the state politicians were all staring at me, their checkbooks still resting on the silk tablecloths. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice rolling over the crowd like a heavy storm cloud. "Please put your pens down and put your checkbooks away. You are about to hand your hard-earned millions to a man who is completely, absolutely bankrupt." A collective gasp rippled through the massive room. The wealthy elite shifted in their seats, exchanging shocked, terrified glances. Richard Kensington let out a strangled, panicked noise, but I did not let him interrupt. Richard Kensington just stood on this stage and asked you to invest $10 million in a state-of-the-art eco-resort. I continued pacing slowly across the stage, owning the room completely. He told you he had the land. He told you he was securing the future. But the Green Horizon Initiative does not exist. There are no blueprints. There are no permits. It is nothing but a desperate fairy tale invented by a man who is currently drowning in a $30 million ocean of toxic debt. He planned to take your investment checks tonight, move the cash to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands before midnight, and leave you all holding the bag. The crowd erupted into furious whispers. Men in tailored suits began snatching their checks off the tables, tearing them into pieces. Women covered their mouths in horror. The grand illusion of the Kensington dynasty was cracking wide open under the bright chandelier lights. Richard stepped forward, trembling violently. "That is a lie," he screamed, pointing a shaky finger at me. "Do not listen to him. He is just a bitter, poor old man. I have the contract. I have the 50 hectares of commercial real estate. He signed it over to us not even an hour ago. We have the collateral." I stopped pacing. I turned to look at Richard, and I let a cold, dark smile spread across my face. "You are right, Richard," I said, speaking directly into the microphone. "You do have a piece of paper. You stood on this stage and you forced me to sign a transfer deed in front of all these people. You thought you were humiliating me. You thought you were stealing my family legacy to save your own miserable skin. But you forgot one very important rule of business. You never trust a man who has absolutely nothing to lose." I pointed to the heavy leather-bound folder that Richard was clutching tightly against his chest. "I did not sign that document with my legal name." I revealed, my voice echoing through the stunned ballroom. and I did not stamp it with a valid corporate seal. The land you just bragged about, the 50 hectares you were planning to use to save your company from federal foreclosure, has belonged to a highly protected anonymous trust for 3 decades. The signature I put on your precious paper was a deliberate fake. The brass stamp I used belonged to a shell company named Horizon Builders Incorporated, a company that I legally, completely, and permanently dissolved in a bankruptcy court exactly 5 years ago. The air was sucked right out of the room. The wealthy guests stared at the stage in absolute disbelief. "That piece of paper you are holding," I said, looking straight into Richard's terrified eyes, "is legally worthless. It is a ghost. It is garbage. You do not own my land, Richard. You do not own a single solitary grain of dirt." Richard Kensington's face turned the color of ash. He looked down at the leather folder clutched in his hands, as if it had just turned into a venomous snake. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely get the folder open. He flipped past the title pages, frantically searching for the signature line, his bloodshot eyes locked onto the messy scrawl and the bright red ink of the brass stamp. Horizon Builders Incorporated, a dead company, a worthless agreement. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He staggered backward, bumping into the table, holding the massive 6-tier wedding cake. The crystal champagne glasses rattled. His entire empire, his mansion, his cars, his reputation, it was all gone. It had all vanished in the red ink of an old contractor stamp. He looked up at me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He lost whatever tiny shred of sanity he had left. As Richard screamed his empty threats about lawyers and lawsuits, the entire ballroom watched a man completely unravel. The venture capitalists who had been kissing his ring just 10 minutes ago were now pulling out their cell phones, furiously texting their own legal teams to sever all ties with the Kensington Group. The elite society that Richard had sacrificed his soul to impress was now looking at him like a diseased animal. I watched Julian standing next to the wedding cake. My son was breathing rapidly, his eyes darting back and forth between his furious father-in-law and the calm, steady presence of the father he had just betrayed. Julian was slowly realizing that he had not married into a royal family. He had married into a sinking ship, and he had personally burned the only lifeboat that could have saved him. "You tricked me," Richard roared, his voice cracking with hysterical desperation. He threw the useless leather folder onto the floor. "You lied to me, you filthy, poor old man. I will destroy you for this. I will call my legal team right now. We will sue you for fraud. We will take you to federal court. I will have my lawyers crush you into dust." I stood perfectly still under the bright stage lights. I looked at the broken, sweating billionaire throwing a temper tantrum at his daughter's wedding. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I brought the microphone to my lips and delivered the cold, undeniable truth. "I am looking forward to seeing you in court, Richard," I said, my tone dropping to a lethal, chilling whisper. "But tell me something. With what money are you going to hire those lawyers?" On my son's wedding day, he looked me dead in the eye, called me an embarrassment, and shaved my head in front of his wealthy new family. He thought he was erasing my dignity to fit into his new high society life. The entire room fell silent. I stood there humiliated but quiet. I did not scream. I did not fight back. I just watched my hair fall to the floor. But what I did exactly 2 hours later brought his entire millionaire wedding crashing down on the most important day of his life. The question hung in the cold air of the silent ballroom. Richard Kensington had just threatened to crush me with his expensive lawyers, and I had just asked him what money he planned to use to hire them. He stood on the stage, sweating profusely, his chest heaving as his panicked brain tried to process the sheer magnitude of the trap he had just stepped into. But before he could even attempt to formulate a pathetic response, the heavy double mahogany doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom flew open with a massive echoing thud. The 300 wealthy guests sitting at their perfectly decorated tables instantly turned their heads toward the back of the room. The string quartet had long since stopped playing, leaving nothing but the sound of heavy, determined footsteps echoing against the imported marble floors. Walking straight down the center aisle, cutting through the sea of terrified venture capitalists and corrupt politicians, was Maxine. She looked like the absolute grim reaper of the corporate world. She wore a razor-sharp black-tailored suit, and her heels clicked against the floor with the steady, terrifying rhythm of a ticking time bomb. But she was not alone. Flanking her on both sides were 4 highly trained forensic auditors wearing matching dark suits and holding thick, heavy metal briefcases. They moved with absolute military precision, entirely ignoring the lavish wedding decorations and the staring billionaires. They were not there to celebrate. They were there to perform a complete financial autopsy on the Kensington dynasty. The crowd of elites parted for them instinctively. These wealthy people knew exactly what a federal audit team looked like. They could smell the legal blood in the water, and they desperately pulled their chairs back to avoid getting splashed by the incoming slaughter. Richard Kensington watched them march down the aisle, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. He recognized the unmistakable posture of corporate executioners. Maxine reached the wooden steps of the stage and walked up without breaking her stride. The four auditors stopped at the bottom of the stairs, standing in a perfect line, turning their cold, calculating eyes toward the audience to ensure no one interfered. Maxine walked directly over to me. She did not look at Richard. She did not look at my horrified son, Julian. She simply opened her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. The bright red acquisition stamps from the state courthouse glared violently against the crisp white paper. It was the physical manifestation of total, absolute ruin. Maxine handed the heavy stack of papers to me with a sharp professional nod and stepped back, folding her arms across her chest. I took the documents and walked slowly over to the small table holding the massive 6-tier wedding cake. I lifted the heavy stack of legal papers and slammed them down directly next to the pristine white frosting. The impact was so hard the crystal champagne glasses rattled and a small piece of the cake crumbled onto the tablecloth. Richard I said, speaking clearly into the microphone so every single person in the massive ballroom could hear the exact details of his destruction. Your fraudulent real estate group is currently carrying $30 million in toxic high-interest debt. You borrowed that money from dangerous, unregulated shadow lenders because every legitimate bank in this country realized you were running a pathetic Ponzi scheme. You have been moving stolen money around for 5 years, pretending to be a titan of industry while secretly begging criminals for cash to keep your mansion and your luxury cars. Richard shook his head rapidly, his eyes wide with wild, desperate denial. He tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. Those dangerous men were coming to collect their $30 million on Monday morning. I continued pacing slowly around the cake table, locking my cold eyes onto him. That is why you needed my land. That is why you held me down in a private room and shaved my head, trying to break my spirit so I would sign away my family legacy. You were trying to steal my dirt to use as fake collateral to save your own miserable life. I stopped pacing and picked up the top document from the stack, holding it up so the bright red courthouse stamps were visible to the entire room. But it is a very funny coincidence. Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, chilling register. You see, an anonymous private equity firm called Vanguard Equities reached out to your shadow lenders just 10 minutes ago. We offered them a massive premium in cold, hard cash to buy your entire debt portfolio. And because those criminals are businessmen first, they were more than happy to sell your miserable soul to the highest bidder. Julian stumbled backward, bumping into a floral arrangement. He looked at me with absolute sheer terror, finally beginning to understand the unimaginable scale of the power I commanded. I am Vanguard Equities, I declared, letting the heavy absolute weight of those 3 words crush whatever pathetic hope they had left. I am the sole owner of your entire $30 million debt. I own the mortgage on your corporate headquarters. I own the aggressive liens on your luxury vehicles. I own the deed to your sprawling estate. As of 10 minutes ago, the mighty Kensington family does not own a single solitary asset to their name. Richard's knees finally buckled. He collapsed onto the wooden stage, grasping at the table, holding the wedding cake to keep himself from hitting the floor. He was hyperventilating, his perfect world completely shattering around him. And because I am your primary legal creditor, I announced, my voice booming with unwavering authority, I get to enforce the strict terms of your loans. Standard contracts dictate a 30-day grace period for any financial defaults. However, thanks to the incredibly stupid and highly illegal stunt you pulled by trying to use a fraudulent contract tonight, I am officially invoking the immediate acceleration clause. Attempting to secure funding through fraud grants the creditor the absolute right to demand total repayment instantly. You have exactly 0 seconds to pay me $30 million, which means right now at this exact moment I am foreclosing on your entire empire. The reality of the situation hit the stage like a physical shockwave. They were completely legally and officially bankrupt. They were ruined in front of the entire city elite. But arrogant privilege does not die quietly. Chloe, the beautiful glowing bride, suddenly snapped, The polished, elegant mask of the high society princess melted away completely, revealing a vicious, spoiled, and deeply racist child underneath. She lunged forward, her expensive laced gown dragging across the floor, pointing her manicured finger directly at my face. "You are a liar!" she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical, echoing painfully through the microphone. "You do not own any investment fund. You are nothing but a filthy, poor old construction worker. You came from the slums. You spent your whole life breathing dirt and laying bricks. People like you do not buy out people like us. You are just a pathetic ghetto mechanic trying to ruin my perfect wedding." She stood there, chest heaving, completely losing her mind in front of 300 horrified guests. She thought insulting my background would somehow magically erase the legal documents sitting on her cake table. She thought her white wealth made her invincible. I did not yell back. I did not show a single ounce of anger. I just looked at her with pure, cold pity. I slowly lowered the microphone and pointed my calloused index finger directly down at the polished wooden floorboards of the stage. "You are absolutely right about one thing, daughter-in-law," I said, my voice dead calm but carrying enough lethal force to freeze the blood in her veins. "I did come from the slums. I did spend 40 years breathing concrete dust and building things with my bare hands. But you see, the slum taught me how to save my money in the dark, while people like your father were busy spending stolen cash in the light." I kept my finger pointed firmly at the ground, and that slum birthed enough quiet money for me to do something very special 3 years ago, I revealed, staring directly into her terrified, weeping eyes. When this ultra-luxury country club was secretly facing total bankruptcy, I stepped in and bought an 80% controlling stake. Chloe's face went completely blank. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Julian let out a choked, agonizing gasp behind her. "That is right, Chloe," I whispered, leaning slightly forward. "I do not just own your family debt. I own the grass outside. I own the crystal chandeliers hanging above your head. I own the very floorboards you are standing on right now. I am the absolute owner of this country club." I straightened my posture, looking at the ruined, crying bride and the broken men trembling around her. "And as the owner of this establishment, I declared, my voice ringing with absolute finality, your wedding reception is officially canceled. Get out of my building." On my son's wedding day, he looked me dead in the eye, called me an embarrassment, and shaved my head in front of his wealthy new family. He thought he was erasing my dignity to fit into his new high society life. The entire room fell silent. I stood there humiliated but quiet. I did not scream. I did not fight back. I just watched my hair fall to the floor. But what I did exactly 2 hours later brought his entire millionaire wedding crashing down on the most important day of his life. The words I just spoke hung heavily over the massive ballroom. "Get out of my building." The absolute authority in my voice echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system and bounced off the crystal chandeliers I secretly owned. For a few agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The 300 VIP guests were completely frozen in their seats. These were the wealthiest, most powerful people in the state. They were politicians, hedge fund managers, and real estate moguls who spent their entire lives believing they were the smartest people in any room. But looking up at the wooden stage, they finally realized they had been played for absolute fools by the very man they had come to celebrate. The paralyzing shock broke all at once. The collective gasp of the crowd quickly morphed into a chaotic, panicked frenzy. The polite classical music was long gone, replaced by the deafening sound of scraping chairs and angry shouting. The venture capitalists and tech executives who had been eagerly writing personal checks just moments ago suddenly snapped out of their greedy trances. They realized that Richard Kensington, the man they thought was a visionary titan, was actually a desperate criminal standing on the edge of a $30 million cliff. I watched from the stage as men in custom tuxedos practically dove across the silk tablecloths to snatch back the checks they had written for the fake Green Horizon initiative. They tore the crisp pieces of paper into tiny shreds, throwing them onto the floor like toxic waste. But snatching back their money was not enough for me. I wanted to completely eradicate the fake legacy Richard had built. I wanted these people to know exactly how little he thought of them. I reached into the pocket of my cheap beige suit and pulled out the small digital recording device Maxine had given me in the logistics office. I walked over to the microphone stand and held the small speaker directly against the microphone. I pressed the play button. The audio recording blared through the massive speakers, filling the entire ballroom with the undeniable sound of Richard Kensington's own voice. The guests stopped tearing up their checks, and looked up at the stage, their faces twisting in pure outrage as they listened to the conversation from the private bridal suite. They heard Richard drunkenly bragging about how easy it was to manipulate his wealthy friends. They heard him explicitly outline his plan to collect $10 million in seed funding tonight and wire it directly to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands before the weekend was over. They heard him call them a room full of rich idiots who would gladly hand over their money for an imaginary eco-resort. The recording clicked off, leaving a deafening, heavy silence in its wake. But that silence only lasted for a fraction of a second before the ballroom absolutely exploded in fury. The ultra-wealthy do not forgive betrayal, and they certainly do not forgive being made to look stupid in public. The elite society that Richard had spent decades kissing up to turned on him with the vicious speed of a pack of starving wolves. State senators who had been drinking his champagne began shouting curses, pointing furious fingers at the stage. Wealthy socialites who had just kissed his wife on the cheek were screaming that they would see him rot in federal prison. Hundreds of cell phones were instantly pulled out of pockets and expensive purses as the guests frantically dialed their private legal teams, instructing them to freeze all pending transactions and prepare massive lawsuits against the Kensington Group. The room became a chaotic storm of absolute venom and hatred, all directed entirely at the man standing on the stage. Richard Kensington could not handle the crushing weight of his public annihilation. He looked out at the sea of furious faces, the very people he needed to survive, and realized that his name was now completely radioactive. His chest began to heave violently. He clawed at the collar of his expensive silk shirt, gasping for air as a massive panic attack took over his body. His knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed heavily onto the hard wooden floorboards of the stage. He curled into a pathetic, trembling ball, clutching his chest and wheezing uncontrollably, while his fake empire burned to ash all around him. His wife, sitting at the front VIP table, let out a horrifying, blood-curdling scream. She scrambled up the wooden stairs of the stage, her expensive designer gown catching on the edge of a step. She threw herself onto the floor next to her hyperventilating husband. The pristine, elegant facade she had carefully maintained all evening was completely shattered. She sobbed hysterically, her expensive mascara running down her face in thick black streaks, ruining her perfect makeup. She looked up at the angry crowd, begging them to stop shouting, pleading with them to understand, but nobody offered her a single ounce of sympathy. They looked at her like she was a criminal accomplice standing in the wreckage of a massive fraud. I stood tall amidst the absolute destruction, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I did not feel pity. I did not feel sorrow. I just watched the garbage take itself out. Then I turned my attention to the other side of the stage. I looked at my son. Julian was standing completely frozen next to the untouched 6-tier wedding cake. His face was the color of a pale ghost. His jaw was slack and his eyes were wide with a profound, earth-shattering disbelief. The psychological whiplash he was experiencing in that exact moment was almost visible. He was a young man who had sacrificed his entire moral compass, his own blood and his own father, just to secure a seat at the table of the elite. And now that table had violently flipped over, crushing him underneath it. Julian looked down at his new father-in-law, a man he had idolized, and called his true family, currently writhing on the floor, gasping for breath like a dying fish. He realized that the mighty Kensington dynasty he had worshipped was nothing but a gang of desperate, soon-to-be-jailed fraudsters. They had zero money, zero power, and zero future. Then Julian slowly turned his head and looked at me. He looked at the old black man standing powerfully on the stage. He looked at the cheap beige suit he had forced me to wear, and the raw scratches on the bald head he had personally shaved just 2 hours ago. He realized with a sickening wave of absolute horror that the father he had violently pinned down and humiliated in a private lounge was actually a hidden billionaire. He realized that the working-class contractor he had called an embarrassment was the anonymous titan who owned the country club, the ground they stood on, and the very debt that had just ruined his new family. He had traded an actual empire for a completely worthless fake kingdom. The weight of his massive, unforgivable mistake crushed his shoulders. His custom white tuxedo suddenly looked like a tragic clown costume. He was completely alone, surrounded by furious billionaires screaming for blood, and a father who had officially disowned him. Desperate for a lifeline, desperate for any shred of the high society dream he thought he had secured, Julian turned his terrified eyes toward Chloe. He reached out his trembling hand toward his beautiful bride, hoping to find some comfort, hoping that their love was at least real in the midst of this terrifying nightmare. He looked at her, waiting for her to hold his hand and tell him they would survive this together. On my son's wedding day, he looked me dead in the eye, called me an embarrassment, and shaved my head in front of his wealthy new family. He thought he was erasing my dignity to fit into his new high society life. The entire room fell silent. I stood there humiliated but quiet. I did not scream. I did not fight back. I just watched my hair fall to the floor. But what I did exactly 2 hours later brought his entire millionaire wedding crashing down on the most important day of his life. The grand ballroom was no longer a place of celebration. It was a spectacular graveyard of fake wealth and shattered egos. The wealthy elite were still shouting demanding answers, calling their lawyers, and scrambling to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of Richard Kensington. But right in the center of the wooden stage, amidst the wreckage of his perfectly curated high society dream, my son Julian was drowning. He stood frozen next to the untouched 6-tier wedding cake. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the devastation I had just unleashed. He had turned his back on the father who bled for him to worship a family of criminals, and now that family was collapsing right in front of his eyes. Desperate for a single anchor in the violent storm, Julian turned his terrified gaze toward his beautiful bride. Chloe was standing a few feet away, her pristine laced wedding gown trembling as she took in the horrific reality of her father writhing on the floor and the angry mob of billionaires shouting at the stage. Julian reached out his shaking hand toward her. He needed her to hold him. He needed her to tell him that their love was real and that they would somehow get through this absolute nightmare together. He looked at her with the pathetic, hopeful eyes of a man who still believed he belonged in her world. "Chloe," he whispered, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Chloe, please look at me. We can fix this. We are husband and wife." Chloe slowly turned her head. But the look in her eyes was not love. It was not comfort. It was pure, unadulterated venom. The polished, elegant princess facade had completely vaporized, leaving nothing but a vicious, entitled, and deeply hateful woman. She looked at Julian's outstretched hand like it was covered in a deadly disease. Before Julian could even take a step closer, Chloe raised her arm and swung it with all the strength she possessed. The sharp, agonizing crack of her open palm striking Julian across the face echoed like a gunshot, even over the chaotic noise of the ballroom. The impact was so violent it snapped Julian head to the side. He stumbled backward, completely blindsided by the physical blow. A bright red handprint instantly bloomed across his cheek, contrasting starkly with his pale, terrified face. He reached up to touch his burning skin, looking at the woman he had just married with absolute shattered disbelief. "Do not touch me, you pathetic loser," Chloe screamed, her voice shrill and echoing with absolute hatred. Her beautiful face was twisted into an ugly, terrifying snarl. "You told me your father had land. You told me that dirt would save my family from bankruptcy. You promised us that you could control him and get the deed. That was the only reason I ever let you put a ring on my finger?" Julian took another step back, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with horror, as the brutal truth finally began to spill from her lips. "You really thought I loved you?" Chloe laughed, a vicious, hysterical sound that sent chills down my spine. "You really thought someone like me would ever actually want to spend my life with a worthless charity case like you? You are nothing but a leech, Julian. You are just a pathetic social climber who wanted to ride our coattails into high society. You brought absolutely nothing to this family except a fake piece of paper and a crazy old man who just ruined my entire life. I never loved you. I have always despised you." The words did not just hurt Julian, they completely destroyed him. Chloe, cruel, unapologetic confession acted like a sledgehammer, instantly smashing the fragile fake mirror he had used to view himself for the last 3 years. The grand illusion was entirely gone. The Kensington family did not see him as a brilliant, ambitious young man. They did not see him as an equal. They saw him as a convenient tool. They saw him as a token minority they could manipulate to steal real estate. He had sold his own blood, he had completely abandoned the father who broke his back to feed him, and he had traded his very soul for a love that was completely built on absolute fraud and disgust. He had shaved his own fatherhead just to appease people who secretly thought he was garbage. Julian's legs gave out. The sheer psychological weight of the betrayal crushed whatever was left of his fake, arrogant pride. He dropped to his knees on the hard wooden floorboards right in front of the massive wedding cake. He was sobbing now, loud, agonizing gasps that tore through his throat. He looked at Richard Kensington sobbing on the floor, He looked at Chloe, who was already turning her back on him, desperately trying to find a way out of the ballroom. And then he looked up at me. He looked at the quiet, powerful billionaire standing calmly on the stage, the man he had dismissed as an uneducated slum worker, the man who actually owned the entire world he was desperately trying to buy his way into. Julian began to crawl. Right there on the stage in front of the remaining furious guests and the country club security team, my son crawled across the floorboards toward me, his custom white tuxedo dragged against the wood, picking up the spilled champagne and the dirt. He was no longer the arrogant groom. He was a broken, terrified child realizing he had just stepped off a cliff. He reached my heavy work boots and wrapped his arms tightly around my legs, clutching the fabric of my cheap beige suit pants. "Dad," he wailed, his voice unrecognizable, choked with tears and absolute pathetic desperation. "Dad, I am so sorry. Please, please help me. They tricked me. They used me. I did not know they were criminals. I did not know they were going to do this. You have to save me, Dad. I am your son. I am your only son. Please do not leave me with them. I will do anything. Just take me home." He buried his weeping face against my knees, soaking the cheap polyester fabric with his tears. He was begging for the unconditional love he had violently thrown away just 2 hours ago. He expected me to do what I had always done. He expected me to absorb his mistakes, clean up his massive mess, and protect him from the harsh reality of the world. I stood perfectly still. I did not reach down to touch his shoulder. I did not offer him a single ounce of comfort. I slowly looked away from his sobbing form and glanced at the nearby table holding the wedding cake. Resting next to the cake was a tall crystal champagne flute. The smooth, polished glass caught the bright lights of the chandelier overhead, acting like a perfect curved mirror. I stared at my reflection in the crystal glass. I looked at my completely bare scalp. I looked at the angry red scratches Julian had carelessly left on my skin when he forced the heavy electric clippers across my head in the VIP lounge. He had stripped away my physical connection to his late mother. He had tried to strip away my dignity. He had called me an embarrassment while pinning me down like an animal. I slowly bent down. The joints in my old knees popped slightly as I crouched, bringing my face level with his. Julian looked up, his eyes red and swollen, practically begging for a lifeline, begging for a fatherly embrace. He stopped crying for a brief second, hoping that my proximity meant I was finally going to forgive him and pull him out of the wreckage. I leaned in very close so the microphones could not pick up my voice. I positioned my lips right next to his ear. The ballroom was still chaotic, but in this tiny space between a father and a son, there was only a terrifying, heavy silence. I took a slow breath and delivered the final, fatal blow. "You are not my son," I whispered, my voice devoid of any warmth, any anger, or any love. "My son died the moment you put those clippers to my head." I pulled back and watched the absolute, total devastation wash over his face. The tiny spark of hope in his eyes was instantly, violently extinguished. He realized with absolute certainty that there was no coming back from this. He had completely destroyed his only safe harbor, and now he was going to drown alone in the open ocean. On my son's wedding day, he looked me dead in the eye, called me an embarrassment, and shaved my head in front of his wealthy new family. He thought he was erasing my dignity to fit into his new high society life. The entire room fell silent. I stood there humiliated but quiet. I did not scream. I did not fight back. I just watched my hair fall to the floor. But what I did exactly 2 hours later brought his entire millionaire wedding crashing down on the most important day of his life. Julian was clinging to my legs, sobbing into the cheap fabric of my beige trousers. He was begging for a second chance, begging for the father he had just violently betrayed. I looked down at him, feeling the cool air against my completely bare scalp. I remembered his mother, Vivian. I remembered how she held him as a baby, how she told me to always protect him. But the man weeping on the floor was not the boy we raised. He was a stranger who had sold his soul for a counterfeit crown. I reached down and grabbed his wrists. My hands, rough and heavily calloused from decades of hard labor, locked onto his soft, manicured skin. I did not pull him up into an embrace. I forcefully peeled his fingers off my legs and shoved his hands away with a cold, definitive finality. "You shaved away your last connection to me with your own hands, Julian," I said, my voice projecting clearly over his pathetic weeping. "You did not just cut my hair in that private lounge. You cut the final tie to your own blood. You chose these people. You chose this fake world. I have no son who spits on his mother legacy just to impress a room full of thieves. Julian collapsed completely against the wooden floorboards, burying his face in his hands, screaming in absolute agony. He finally understood that there was no safety net left. The bridge was not just burned, it had been completely obliterated. I stepped over his trembling body and turned my attention to Marcus, who was standing at attention at the bottom of the stage stairs. Beside him stood Maxine, looking at her encrypted tablet with a lethal smile. The time for talking was officially over. The execution of the Kensington Empire needed to be completed. Marcus I commanded my voice, echoing with the absolute unquestionable authority of a true titan. These people are no longer guests of the Oak Ridge Country Club. They are trespassers on my private property. I want them removed immediately. I turned to Maxine. Contact the banking executives. Freeze every single account connected to the Kensington family. The corporate accounts, the personal checking, the offshore trusts, freeze them all. I want their credit cards to bounce before they even hit the pavement outside. Maxine nodded, her fingers moving rapidly across the screen. Consider it done, boss, she replied smoothly. They officially have $0 to their names. The order hung in the air like a guillotine dropping. The remaining wealthy guests who had not already fled the ballroom watched in absolute stunned silence as the real power in the room exerted total control. Marcus gave a sharp hand signal to his tactical security team. They moved with terrifying efficiency. 2 massive guards marched right up to Richard Kensington, who was still gasping for air on the stage floor. They did not treat him like a billionaire real estate mogul. They treated him like a common criminal who had broken into a house. They grabbed Richard roughly by the collar of his expensive custom silk shirt and hauled him to his feet. Richard kicked and thrashed, his face completely red. "Do not touch me," he screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "I am Richard Kensington. You cannot do this to me. I will have your badges. I will destroy you." The security guards did not even blink. They twisted his arms behind his back and literally dragged him off the stage. His expensive leather shoes scraped uselessly against the marble floor as they hauled him, kicking and screaming, straight toward the main exit. Then my eyes landed on Chloe. The beautiful, arrogant bride was frozen near the wedding cake, watching her father being dragged away like a sack of garbage. She was breathing heavily, her perfect blonde hair now a messy tangle. As she turned to run toward the exit to follow her father, I raised my hand and pointed directly at her chest. "Stop her," I ordered calmly. A female security officer immediately stepped in front of Chloe, blocking her path. Chloe shrieked, commanding the officer to move, but she was trapped. I walked slowly over to the bride, my heavy work boots thudding against the stage. "You called me a filthy, poor old construction worker," I said, looking at her terrified face. "You bragged about your wealth. But you are wearing something that does not belong to you." Chloe looked confused for a second before her hands instinctively flew up to her neck to touch the massive, sparkling diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. She had proudly flaunted those diamonds all evening, claiming they were a gift from Julian to welcome her into her new life. "Those diamonds," I explained, my tone completely devoid of mercy, "were purchased 3 weeks ago by Julian." "But Julian does not have any money of his own, Chloe. He never did. He bought that jewelry using a secondary credit card that is directly tied to my personal bank account, the bank account of the filthy old black man you just mocked. Since I just legally froze every single asset tied to your fraudulent family, that necklace officially belongs to me." Chloe's face turned a ghostly pale white. She clutched the diamonds tightly, shaking her head. "No," she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "You cannot take this. It is my wedding day." I looked at the female security officer and gave a brief nod. The officer stepped forward without hesitation. She reached around Chloe's neck and unclasped the heavy diamond necklace, pulling it right off the bride's skin. Chloe let out a pathetic, humiliated sob as the sparkling jewels were dropped directly into my calloused hand. I slipped the diamonds into the pocket of my cheap beige suit. "Now," I said, looking at the ruined bride, "get off my stage." The officer grabbed Chloe by the arm and marched her down the stairs, following the path where her father had just been dragged out. The grand ballroom was finally clearing out. The nightmare I had orchestrated was reaching its absolute peak. Julian was still on the floor, completely broken. The Kensington family had been stripped of their money, their pride, and their fake royalty. They were being thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing. I thought the evening was finally over. I thought the punishment was complete. But as I stood on the stage looking out at the empty tables, I heard a new sound piercing through the heavy silence of the night. It was not the classical music of the string quartet. It was a loud, high-pitched, wailing sound echoing from outside the country club. I looked down at Maxine. She was holding her tablet, her lethal smile wider than before. "What is that sound?" I asked quietly. Maxine looked up at me, her eyes gleaming with absolute triumph. "Well, boss," she said smoothly, "freezing their bank accounts was just a financial courtesy. But when I acquired their debt portfolio, I also acquired their completely unredacted internal ledgers, the ones detailing 5 years of massive wire fraud and grand larceny. I sent those ledgers to the Federal Bureau of Investigation 30 minutes ago." The loud wailing sound grew completely deafening as bright flashing red and blue lights began to illuminate the massive stained glass windows of the grand ballroom. The sirens were not just passing by. They were surrounding the entire building. The Kensington family was not just being thrown out onto the cold street. They were walking straight into a massive federal ambush. The wedding reception had officially become a major crime scene, and the trap was finally permanently shut. On my son's wedding day, he looked me dead in the eye, called me an embarrassment, and shaved my head in front of his wealthy new family. He thought he was erasing my dignity to fit into his new high society life. The entire room fell silent. I stood there humiliated but quiet. I did not scream. I did not fight back. I just watched my hair fall to the floor. But what I did exactly 2 hours later brought his entire millionaire wedding crashing down on the most important day of his life. I walked out of the grand ballroom, leaving the shattered remains of the Kensington dynasty behind me. The heavy mahogany doors closed, shutting out the pathetic sobbing of the people who genuinely thought they owned the world. I stepped into the grand foyer of the country club. The air was incredibly thick with panic. The wealthy elite guests who had just been inside drinking vintage champagne were now stampeding toward the main exit like rats fleeing a rapidly sinking ship. They were pushing each other out of the way, desperate to escape the massive federal raid that was currently unfolding right on the front steps of my building. I pushed through the glass double doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The sky had completely opened up and a steady freezing rain was beginning to fall over the Oak Ridge Country Club. But the darkness of the night was completely pierced by the blinding, flashing red and blue lights of a dozen Federal Bureau of Investigation vehicles. They had aggressively surrounded the entire circular driveway, cutting off any possible escape route. The wailing sirens had stopped, replaced by the sharp, authoritative shouting of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow letters across their backs. I stood perfectly dry under the massive stone awning of the club entrance, watching the ultimate consequence of unchecked arrogance and greed. Richard Kensington, the man who had ordered my head to be shaved. The man who tried to steal my family land to cover his massive criminal fraud was currently being slammed against the wet hood of a black federal SUV. 2 large agents roughly twisted his arms behind his back. The loud metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed sharply through the rainy night. It was the most beautiful sound I had heard in years. Richard was not wearing his arrogant smirk anymore. He was weeping openly, his expensive silk shirt soaked with freezing rain and sweat, completely broken and humiliated in front of the entire city elite. He was no longer a titan of real estate. He was just another federal inmate waiting to be processed. His wife was faring no better. She was being dragged down the wet stone steps by a strong female agent. She was thrashing wildly, screaming obscenities and kicking her expensive designer heels into the muddy puddles forming on the pavement. The heavy rain washed away her perfect makeup, leaving dark, hollow streaks running down her face. She looked like a terrifying ghost of her former high society self. The wealthy guests, the venture capitalists, and the politicians who used to kiss her cheek at charity galas were now completely ignoring her. They were hiding under massive black umbrellas, held by their personal drivers, running to their luxury town cars, looking at the arrested family with absolute pure disgust. They treated the Kensingtons like a highly contagious disease, desperate to avoid being photographed anywhere near the criminals. And then there was Julian, my son. The boy I had sacrificed my entire life to protect and elevate. The security team of the country club, acting on my direct orders, physically escorted Julian out the front doors and pushed him directly into the freezing rain. He stumbled on the wet pavement, almost falling to his knees. He was completely alone. He had no umbrella. He had no coat. The heavy downpour immediately soaked his custom white tuxedo. The expensive fabric clung to his skin, turning translucent and utterly pathetic. He stood there shivering violently, watching his new family being shoved roughly into the back of the federal police cruisers. Julian reached into his soaked pockets, frantically searching for his phone. He pulled it out, trying to call a cab, trying to call anyone who could save him from the nightmare. But his phone screen was completely black. Maxine had officially frozen every single account tied to him. His credit cards, his banking apps, his entire digital financial existence had been completely erased by my legal team. He had absolutely $0 and 0 cents to his name. He could not even afford a bus ticket to get across town. As he stood there shivering in the cold, a massive heavy-duty tow truck with flashing yellow lights pulled into the driveway, backing up slowly toward the VIP valet parking area. Julian watched in absolute horror as the tow truck backed up directly toward his pristine silver Bentley. That car was his ultimate pride and joy. It was the physical symbol of his fake success, the shiny trophy he bought to prove he truly belonged in the upper class. But he had bought it using a massive line of credit that I had secretly guaranteed through a proxy bank. Since his accounts were officially frozen, the bank was repossessing the vehicle instantly. Maxine had personally ensured the repossession order was expedited for tonight just to add the final nail to his coffin. Julian screamed, running toward the tow truck, waving his arms, desperately pleading with the driver to stop, but the driver ignored him completely, lowering the heavy steel hooks, locking them securely onto the undercarriage of the expensive car and hoisting it up into the rainy air. Julian fell to his knees in a muddy puddle right in the middle of the driveway, watching his entire fake, luxurious life being towed away into the dark night. He was left with nothing but the wet clothes on his back and the crushing realization of his own massive failure. I had seen enough. The garbage had been completely taken out and the streets were finally clean again. I nodded to Marcus, who was standing right beside me holding a large black umbrella. He escorted me down the stone stairs, shielding me entirely from the freezing rain. We walked toward a sleek, understated black town car waiting quietly at the edge of the driveway. I did not need a flashy silver Bentley to prove my worth to the world. True power moves in absolute silence. Marcus opened the heavy rear door for me, and I slid into the warm, dry leather interior of the vehicle. Julian heard the heavy car door close. He turned his head from the muddy puddle and saw me sitting comfortably in the back of the town car. The realization hit him like a brutal physical blow to the chest. The father he had violently disowned, the father he had humiliated in front of strangers, the anonymous billionaire who had just orchestrated the total destruction of his entire world, was driving away, leaving him to freeze in the rain. Panic, absolute primal terror seized his entire body. He scrambled to his feet, slipping on the wet pavement, and began to sprint. He ran past the federal agents, past the flashing red and blue lights, chasing directly after my slow-moving car. "Dad," he screamed, his voice cracking painfully over the loud sound of the heavy rain and the wailing police sirens. "Dad, please wait. Do not leave me here." He reached the side of the town car and slammed his wet, freezing hands against the dark, tinted window. He was weeping uncontrollably, his white tuxedo completely ruined, covered in dark mud and rainwater. "Dad, please let me in," he begged, pounding frantically on the thick glass, shivering so violently his teeth chattered. "I have nowhere to go. I have no money left. Please, just give me a ride. You are my father. I am your son. Please, Dad, save me." Inside the warm, quiet cabin of the car, I looked at the pathetic figure banging on the glass. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I reached over and pressed a small silver button on the door panel. The dark-tinted window slowly, smoothly rolled down, letting the cold, rainy air enter the warm car. Julian stopped pounding, leaning in with a desperate, hopeful sob, thinking I had finally forgiven him and was going to unlock the door. But as he looked into my eyes, he did not find a forgiving father. He found a man who was completely, entirely empty. I looked at his wet, desperate face, not with anger, not with sadness, but with the absolute chilling indifference of a complete stranger. On my son's wedding day, he looked me dead in the eye, called me an embarrassment, and shaved my head in front of his wealthy new family. He thought he was erasing my dignity to fit into his new high society life. The entire room fell silent. I stood there humiliated but quiet. I did not scream. I did not fight back. I just watched my hair fall to the floor. But what I did exactly 2 hours later brought his entire millionaire wedding crashing down on the most important day of his life. The rain was coming down in thick, freezing sheets, bouncing violently off the shiny black hood of the town car. Julian stood there shivering, his hands gripping the edge of the open window. The cold water dripped from his face, washing away the last remaining traces of the arrogant groom. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, begging for a handout, begging for the unconditional safety net he had just tried to completely destroy. He was crying, begging me to let him into the warm, dry vehicle. He thought that because I was his father, I would automatically fold. He thought my love was a weakness he could exploit to escape the consequences of his own horrific betrayal. I looked at him without a single trace of fatherly warmth. He wanted to live in the world of the elite. He wanted to play the vicious, cutthroat game of wealth and status. It was time for him to finally learn the rules of the board he had chosen to play on. I leaned forward slightly so my voice would cut clearly through the loud sound of the pouring rain and the distant wailing of the federal police sirens. The first lesson of high society, Julian I, said my words perfectly measured and completely devoid of any mercy, is that nobody gives anyone anything for free. You do not get to bite the hand that fed you your entire life and then beg for a warm plate when you are suddenly starving. You chose to abandon your blood. You chose to follow a family of thieves and frauds because you loved the illusion of their money more than you loved your own soul. You wanted their life so badly. Well, now you officially have it. You chose to follow them, so now you are going to learn how to sleep on the wet street exactly like them. I did not wait for his pathetic response. I reached out and pressed the small silver button on the door panel. The thick, dark-tinted window began to glide upward with a smooth, mechanical hum. Julian panicked. He tried to shove his freezing hands inside the car to stop the glass crying out in absolute terrifying terror. But he was weak, and he was cold. The thick glass slid smoothly past his slipping fingers and sealed shut with a heavy, solid click, locking the freezing rain and his loud, agonizing sobbing completely on the outside. I did not look back at him. I told the driver to go. The heavy luxury engine hummed quietly, and the car pulled away from the Oak Ridge Country Club, leaving my only son standing entirely alone in the dark, flooded driveway with absolutely nothing but the wet, ruined clothes on his back. The interior of the town car was perfectly silent and comfortably warm. The chaotic, flashing red and blue lights of the federal raid slowly faded away in the rearview mirror, swallowed completely by the dark, rainy night. I sat back against the premium leather seat and let out a long, slow breath. The intense burning adrenaline that had been keeping my blood running cold for the past 3 hours finally began to recede, leaving behind a deep, profound exhaustion. I raised my right hand and slowly brought it up to my head. My rough, calloused fingers brushed against my bare scalp, feeling the uneven stubble and the small, stinging scratches where Julian had aggressively pushed the electric clippers into my skin. Earlier today, in that private VIP lounge, losing my traditional hair had felt like a profound, devastating violation. It felt like they were actively erasing my personal history and stripping away my dignity for their own sick, racist amusement. But sitting in the quiet darkness of the moving car, I realized something entirely different. I did not feel violated anymore. I felt incredibly light. I felt a profound, unexpected sense of relief washing over my tired old bones. The heavy, agonizing weight of trying to hold on to a son who despised me was entirely gone. I closed my eyes and pictured the beautiful face of my late wife, Vivian. I remembered the soft sound of her voice, the gentle touch of her hands, and the fierce, unbreakable love she had for our family. When she was lying in that sterile hospital bed, knowing her precious time was running incredibly short, she had made me promise her one specific thing. She held my hand tightly and looked at me with tears in her loving eyes. "Desmond," she had whispered, "do not let this boy forget his roots. Do not let him lose his soul to a world that only cares about the price tag on his clothes. Keep him grounded. Keep him real." For decades, I thought keeping that sacred promise meant breaking my back on dusty construction sites to give him every single educational advantage I never had. I thought it meant shielding him from the harsh, brutal realities of poverty and struggle so he could fly higher than I ever did. But my blind protection had turned him into a spoiled, arrogant monster. I had cushioned his life so much that he completely forgot how to stand on his own 2 feet. He forgot the value of hard, honest work and the absolute necessity of loyalty. Tonight I had finally fulfilled Vivian's dying wish. I had forcefully, violently ripped him away from the toxic, fake world he had sold his soul to enter. I had stripped away his fake title, his stolen money, and his arrogant pride. I had burned his counterfeit kingdom directly to the ground. It was the most brutal, devastating thing a father could ever do to his own child. But sometimes, to save a rotting tree, you have to completely chop it down to the base stump and pray that the roots are still strong enough to grow back. I had performed a brutal, necessary amputation to save his soul from permanent corruption. The weekend passed in a blur of relentless legal execution. I did not rest. I did not sleep. I sat in the secure downtown executive offices of Vanguard Equities with Maxine and her elite team of corporate lawyers, systematically dismantling the entire Kensington empire piece by piece. We worked through the night, signing documents, verifying offshore transfers, and ensuring that the trap I had sprung was completely inescapable. By the time the sun came up on Monday morning, the absolute destruction was finalized. The massive federal investigation had completely frozen Richard Kensington out of society. The bank foreclosure was officially processed and stamped by a federal judge. Every single asset, every bank account, the sprawling luxury mansion in the wealthy suburbs, the corporate headquarters downtown, and the fleet of expensive imported cars officially legally belonged to my private equity firm. The Kensington family had been completely wiped off the financial map. They were utterly destitute, facing decades in federal prison for grand larceny and wire fraud. The war was officially over, and the old black contractor had won the absolute unconditional victory. I was standing by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, looking out over the waking city, sipping a hot cup of black coffee. The sky was clear and bright. The heavy storm had finally passed, washing the streets clean. Then the heavy oak door to my office swung open. Maxine walked in, holding her encrypted tablet tightly against her chest. She did not have her usual triumphant, predatory smile. She looked serious, almost hesitant, which was incredibly rare for a woman of her ruthless caliber. "Boss," she said, her voice completely professional but carrying a tight edge of undeniable tension. "The legal transfers are all 100% complete. The foreclosure is absolute. We officially own the Kensington estate and the entire corporate portfolio. But we have a completely unexpected situation downstairs at the main security gate of this building." I turned away from the bright window, taking a slow sip of my coffee, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "What kind of situation?" I asked calmly. Maxine took a deep breath, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "It is Julian Boss," she revealed, her voice dropping slightly. "He has been standing outside the front iron gates of the Vanguard Equities headquarters since 4 o'clock this morning. He is completely soaking wet from the weekend storms. He looks like he has not slept in days, and he is absolutely refusing to leave the premises until he speaks directly to you. On my son's wedding day, he looked me dead in the eye, called me an embarrassment, and shaved my head in front of his wealthy new family. He thought he was erasing my dignity to fit into his new high society life." The entire room fell silent. I stood there humiliated but quiet. I did not scream. I did not fight back. I just watched my hair fall to the floor. But what I did exactly 2 hours later brought his entire millionaire wedding crashing down on the most important day of his life. I set my hot cup of black coffee down on the polished mahogany desk. The steam curled into the cool air of my executive office. I looked at Maxine, who was standing quietly by the door waiting for my command. She told me Julian had been standing outside the iron gates of Vanguard Equities since the early hours of the morning, refusing to move despite the freezing rain and the harsh warnings from the building security team. I did not show a single trace of emotion. I simply told Maxine to have the guards bring him into the main lobby, but to keep him entirely away from the executive elevators. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. I walked out of my corner office and stepped into the private glass elevator. As the elevator descended the 30 floors to the ground level, I looked out through the transparent walls at the sprawling city of Atlanta. I had built a massive, invisible empire in this city, using nothing but calloused hands and a relentless iron will. I had tried to hand that empire to my son on a silver platter, and he had spit on it. Now he was waiting for me at the bottom. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. I stepped out into the massive, pristine atrium of the Vanguard Equities headquarters. The floors were imported white marble, the ceilings were soaring glass, and the security presence was absolute. And standing right in the center of that intimidating wealth was my son. The sight of him was a profound physical shock. The golden boy of high society, the arrogant groom who had worn a custom-tailored white tuxedo just 48 hours ago, was completely gone. In his place stood a shivering, broken shell of a young man. He was still wearing the exact same clothes from the wedding night, but they were completely ruined. The white fabric was stained with dark mud and city grime. His expensive leather shoes were scuffed, waterlogged, and caked with dirt. His hair was a tangled mess, and his face was pale and hollow. He looked like a stray dog that had been beaten and left out in the pouring rain. When Julian saw me approaching, he did not run toward me. He did not demand attention or throw a tantrum like the spoiled child he used to be. He just stood there, completely still, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. I stopped a few feet away from him. The silence in the massive marble lobby was heavy and suffocating. We stared at each other. He looked at my bare, shaved scalp, the physical scar of his ultimate betrayal, and a fresh wave of tears welled up in his red, swollen eyes. He did not try to wipe them away. Julian spoke first. His voice was hoarse and incredibly weak, barely above a whisper. He told me he had spent the last 2 nights sleeping on a cold concrete bench at a public bus stop. He said the freezing rain had cut right through his bones and the gnawing hunger in his stomach had kept him awake in the dark. But he said the physical suffering was absolutely nothing compared to the profound, agonizing shame burning a hole in his chest. He told me he had a lot of time to think about the pathetic man he had become. He realized he had traded a father who would bleed for him for a family of parasites who would gladly sell his soul for a single dollar. He looked at me and confessed that he was entirely disgusted by his own reflection. I stood perfectly still, waiting for the inevitable pivot. I waited for him to beg for a warm bed. I waited for him to ask me to wire a few $1,000s to a new bank account so he could get back on his feet and rent a nice apartment. I expected the plea for mercy, but the request for money never came. Instead, Julian slowly looked down at his own hands. He looked at his soft, perfectly manicured fingers, fingers that had never held a hammer or mixed a single bag of cement. He told me he did not want my money. He told me he did not want a corner office or a title in my massive company. He looked up at me with a new, desperate kind of hunger in his eyes. He asked me for a job. Not a desk job and not a management position. He asked me to send him to the hardest, dirtiest, poorest construction site I owned. He said he wanted to carry heavy bricks in the blistering sun. He wanted to mix concrete until his back ached. He wanted to breathe the thick dust of the earth. He told me he wanted to learn how I built my life. He wanted to remake his soft hands and rebuild his broken soul from the absolute bottom. The sincerity in his broken voice echoed off the marble walls. Any weak father would have crumbled in that exact moment. Any weak father would have pulled his weeping son into a warm, forgiving embrace, wiping away the severe consequences of his betrayal to soothe the immediate pain. But I am not a weak father. I knew that if I gave him a single inch of comfort or a single dollar of unearned support right now, the brutal lesson of the last 2 days would be completely, permanently lost. The arrogant, entitled boy had finally died in the rain, but the strong, honorable man had not yet been born. He needed the fire. He needed the crucible. I did not smile. I did not offer a single word of forgiveness. I simply turned my head and signaled to the head of lobby security standing near the front desk. I instructed the guard to go to the maintenance room and bring me a pair of standard-issue heavy leather work gloves. The lobby remained completely silent until the guard returned a minute later, handing me the thick, rough leather gloves. I looked at Julian. I did not hand the gloves to him gently. I threw them directly at his chest. The heavy leather hit his ruined tuxedo jacket with a dull thud and fell to the polished marble floor. Julian slowly bent down. His knees trembled slightly from pure exhaustion, but he reached out and picked up the gloves, gripping the rough material tightly in his soft hands. I looked him dead in the eye and laid out the absolute non-negotiable terms of his survival. I told him there was a new commercial development breaking ground on the far north side of the city, a brutal, grueling project digging deep into the hard clay. I told him he would report to the site foreman tomorrow morning at exactly 5 o'clock. He would be paid $15 an hour. I told him he would receive absolutely no special privileges, no extra breaks, no favors, and zero protection from the harsh elements. I made it crystal clear that he was strictly forbidden from using the name Holloway on the payroll. He was to be a ghost, a nameless, faceless laborer working quietly in the dirt. I took one single intimidating step closer to him, forcing him to look up into my cold, unyielding eyes. I told him he had to survive on those meager wages alone. He had to figure out how to pay his own rent in a cheap apartment, buy his own groceries, and wash his own filthy work clothes at a laundromat. I told him that If he quit, if he complained to the foreman, or if he ever tried to leverage my anonymous name to get ahead, he would be instantly fired and permanently banished from my sight forever. I let the heavy weight of those brutal conditions settle over his exhausted mind before I delivered the final ultimate sentence. I told him to survive in the dirt for 5 unbroken years. I told him that if he could endure the severe physical pain, the mental exhaustion, and the crushing humility for 5 long years without breaking, then, and only then, could he walk back through these pristine glass doors and earn the right to call me his father again. Julian stood there clutching the rough leather work gloves against his chest. He did not argue the terms. He did not try to negotiate for a better wage or a shorter sentence. The false pride that had poisoned his mind for years was completely eradicated. He simply looked in the gloves, looked back up at me, and gave a single, slow, determined nod of absolute understanding. He turned his back and began to walk slowly toward the heavy glass revolving doors of the lobby. He did not look back over his shoulder. I stood perfectly still in the pristine atrium of my massive empire and watched my only son push through the glass doors, stepping out into the cold, bright morning light. He was a completely penniless laborer stepping into the absolute hardest chapter of his entire life. I did not smile, but a profound, heavy peace finally settled over my heart. I reached up and rubbed my bare-shaved scalp, feeling the rough stubble. I knew this was a brutal, terrifying punishment. I knew the next few years would break him down to his very core. But as I watched him disappear down the busy city street holding those leather gloves like a lifeline, I also knew with absolute, unwavering certainty that this was the only possible salvation for my lost son. The hard dirt would either bury him completely or it would finally teach him how to stand tall. On my son's wedding day, he looked me dead in the eye, called me an embarrassment, and shaved my head in front of his wealthy new family. He thought he was erasing my dignity to fit into his new high society life. The entire room fell silent. I stood there humiliated but quiet. I did not scream. I did not fight back. I just watched my hair fall to the floor. But what I did exactly 2 hours later brought his entire millionaire wedding crashing down on the most important day of his life. The wheels of federal justice usually move incredibly slow for the rich and powerful, but they move with terrifying speed when the rich suddenly become poor. It took exactly 6 months for the Kensington family to face the absolute finality of their horrific crimes. I sat quietly in the back row of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta, wearing my simple charcoal suit, and watched the complete, permanent destruction of their dynasty. Richard Kensington stood before the federal judge, wearing a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit that hung loosely over his shrinking, exhausted frame. He was no longer the arrogant billionaire who threw lavish parties and mocked the working class. He was a broken, terrified old man with absolutely nowhere to hide. The federal judge did not show him a single ounce of mercy. The wooden gavel fell with a heavy, echoing thud. Richard was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal prison without the possibility of early parole for massive wire fraud, financial conspiracy, and grand larceny. His wife received a similar devastating sentence for her direct role in hiding the stolen funds in offshore accounts. Their daughter, Chloe, the beautiful bride who had slapped my son and called me a filthy construction worker, was sentenced to 5 hard years for aiding in the concealment of the criminal enterprise. As the federal marshals led Richard away in heavy steel chains, he looked back across the crowded courtroom and locked his desperate eyes with mine. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked right through him, as if he were entirely invisible. The mighty Kensington name had been completely erased from the earth. Following the sentencing, Maxine and her elite team of corporate lawyers at Vanguard Equities moved with ruthless military precision. We legally liquidated every single asset tied to their fraudulent empire. The sprawling luxury estate in the wealthy suburbs was sold at a massive public auction. Their fleet of imported silver cars, their expensive offshore bank accounts, and their exclusive high society memberships were completely stripped away and sold to pay back the people they had robbed. But there was one specific piece of real estate I absolutely refused to liquidate. I kept the Oak Ridge Country Club. That was the exact place where my son had held me down in a private lounge and shaved my head to appease his new family. It was the place where the elite had looked at my bare scalp with pity and absolute disgust. I owned that building, and I was going to completely cleanse it of its toxic, arrogant history. I ordered my private construction crews to descend upon the massive property. For decades, those towering iron gates had been used to keep people who looked like me entirely on the outside. I put on a yellow hard hat, grabbed a heavy steel sledgehammer, and personally took the first swing at the brick pillars holding those gates up. We tore the heavy iron barricades completely down. We ripped up the pristine golf courses where corrupt billionaires used to make illegal backroom deals, and we laid the groundwork for massive community gardens and state-of-the-art athletic facilities. We stripped the dark, expensive mahogany wood and the elitist oil paintings from the grand ballroom where the disastrous wedding reception had taken place. We knocked down walls to let the natural sunlight pour in, replacing the dark corners with bright open windows, modern technology labs, and massive libraries. I did not want to destroy the building. I wanted to completely transform its very soul. I was going to turn the ultimate symbol of white aristocratic exclusion into a brilliant fortress of opportunity for the very people they had constantly despised. On a bright Tuesday morning, we officially cut the ribbon on the newly renamed Vivian Holloway Cultural Center. I named it after my beautiful late wife, the woman who had always believed in the immense power of education and the deep strength of our roots. The sprawling country club was no longer a private playground for the rich. It was a massive, fully funded educational campus for underprivileged black youth from the surrounding neighborhoods. Kids who had grown up breathing the same dust I did, kids who were told they would never amount to anything in this world, were now walking through the grand marble foyers with their heads held incredibly high. I established a massive financial endowment guaranteeing full college scholarships to any student who maintained their grades and actively gave back to their community. I was taking the millions of dollars that corrupt men like Richard Kensington had hoarded, and I was planting it directly into the fertile soil of the next generation. I wanted to build an army of brilliant, strong young men and women who would never have to sell their souls or shave away their beautiful identity to earn a seat at the table, because we were finally building our own massive table. The absolute shift in the social dynamic of the city was breathtaking to witness. The wealthy elite, the venture capitalists, and the state politicians who had once looked at my cheap beige suit with sheer contempt now understood the terrifying magnitude of my actual power. They finally knew that the quiet black contractor from the slums was actually the anonymous titan who controlled the Vanguard Equities empire. Whenever I walked into a corporate boardroom or attended a city council meeting, the atmosphere in the room instantly changed. The unchecked arrogance evaporated into thin air. Men in $10,000 custom suits would nervously clear their throats and step aside to let me pass. They bowed their heads in deep, respectful submission, not because they suddenly loved me, but because they finally recognized that I held enough financial firepower to eradicate their entire legacies before lunch. I did not care about their fake respect. I did not need their shallow validation. But I deeply understood the absolute necessity of making them remember exactly who was holding the reins of the city. One quiet evening after the cultural center had closed for the day, I walked through the empty halls entirely alone. The setting sun cast long, warm golden shadows across the imported marble floors. I stopped in front of a large mirror hanging in the main hallway right near the room where the VIP lounge used to be. I looked at my reflection in the quiet light. It had been nearly a year since that horrific wedding night. I raised my rough, calloused hand and slowly touched my head. The raw, red scratches were completely healed and gone. My scalp was no longer smooth and bare. A thick, healthy layer of dark hair, heavily salted with bright gray, had grown back, covering my head in tight, resilient coils. The traditional locks that my son had so violently stolen from me were finally beginning to return. It was a slow, quiet process, but it was undeniably happening. Every new inch of growth felt like a profound spiritual rebirth. It was a physical testament to the absolute fact that you can cut away the branches, you can burn the leaves, and you can try to chop down the trunk, but as long as the roots remain deep and strong in the dirt, the tree will always inevitably grow back. I smiled at my reflection, feeling a deep, heavy peace finally settle over my tired old bones. The toxic rot had been completely purged from my life. The monsters were locked away in concrete cages, and the soil of my legacy was finally clean again, completely ready for a brand new, beautiful season of growth. The evening sun dips below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow through the windows of my simple brick house. I am sitting in the quiet living room listening to the soft, familiar hum of the old refrigerator. I walk over to the wooden mantel above the fireplace. Resting right in the center is a silver-framed photograph of my beautiful wife, Vivian. She is smiling in that picture, wearing her favorite yellow summer dress, her natural hair glowing under the bright sun. I stand there for a long time just looking at her face. I reach up and touch my own head, feeling the thick, coarse coils of my new hair growing back in. The violent physical scar of that wedding day has completely healed. I smile back at the photograph, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace settling into my chest. The heavy storm has finally passed and the air in our home is completely clean again. I promised her all those years ago that I would build an unbreakable fortress for our family. I promised her that I would protect our blood and never let the arrogant elite of this city tear down the history we built with our bare, calloused hands. It took 40 years of breaking my back in the concrete dust and saving every single dollar in the absolute shadows to build the Vanguard Equities empire. And when the corporate predators finally came to our door wearing their expensive tailored suits and their fake polite smiles, I did not fight them with loud, angry words. I fought them with the absolute terrifying weight of the silent power I had accumulated. I let Richard Kensington and his fraudulent family believe they had completely conquered me. I let them show their true wicked colors to the entire world before I systematically dismantled their fake dynasty piece by piece. I did not just ruin them. I completely cleaned up the garbage they left behind and turned their toxic aristocratic playground into a vibrant sanctuary for our own people. Silent power is the ultimate weapon in this world. It is the disciplined ability to sit quietly in a crowded room while someone insults your cheap clothes, your natural hair, and your working-class history, knowing full well that you legally hold the absolute mortgage to their entire existence. It is the lethal patience of letting your arrogant enemy dig a massive grave and happily hand you the shovel. But the hardest battle of my entire life was never against the Kensington family. The hardest battle was saving my own son from the toxic poison he had willingly swallowed. Julian thought that dignity could be shaved away with electric clippers and that respect could be easily bought with a silver luxury car. He thought he could erase his rich black history and seamlessly blend into a superficial world that would only ever view him as a convenient token tool. Breaking his heart, throwing him out into the freezing rain, and forcing him to labor in the heavy dirt for $15 an hour was the most agonizing decision a father could ever make. But it was a brutally necessary amputation to save his infected soul. Sometimes a father has to let his child hit the absolute rock-bottom concrete so they can finally understand what a solid, strong foundation actually feels like. Julian is out there right now hauling heavy bricks and mixing wet concrete, sweating under the brutal southern sun. I receive detailed reports from the site foreman every single week. Julian has not complained once. He has not asked for a single favor. He is slowly, painfully rebuilding his soft hands and his broken spirit in the mud. He is finally learning the true absolute meaning of self-respect. And when those 5 long years are officially up, I will be right here standing on this porch, waiting to welcome my real son back home. Moral of the story: true respect cannot be bought with an expensive suit, and dignity is not something you can shave away. When you humiliate the very people who sacrificed everything to build your foundation, you completely destroy your own safety net. Greed and pretension might get you an invitation to the high table, but only absolute authenticity keeps you sitting there. Never underestimate the quiet endurance of someone who built their empire in the dark shadows. The most brutal revenge is not physical violence, it is simply allowing arrogant people to pull the trigger on their own destruction, while you hold the absolute legal deed to the ground they stand on. Did you like my story? Let me know what you would have done in my position down in the comments below. Have you ever had to teach someone a harsh, necessary lesson about respect? If you enjoyed this journey, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so I can keep bringing you more powerful stories like this one. Thank you so much for your sweet support and for listening to an old man share his truth. I am looking forward to reading your thoughts. See you in the next life story with love and respect.